Andrea. Jimmy, can we give it sound check from you? Folks are, maybe we'll do this during introductions. Folks are settled in. Robert, welcome.
Good morning.
Jennifer, welcome. Tucker, Mary, hello. We'll get started in just a minute. Folks, I'll do a little bit of try to figure out when we hit critical mass. But for folks that joined, if you want to just say hello and give a mic and camera check, that'd be terrific. Mary, I see you.
Good morning.
I can hear you. We're getting close. Let's give another 30 seconds or so for folks to show up. Patrick, I see you. Can I hear you? I can't hear you. No.
I'm checking to make sure you can hear Jeff now that I have my headphones on.
I can hear you, Jeff.
Great, thank you.
Laura, you want to say hello? I can see you.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. You're a little soft, but I can hear you.
Okay, thanks.
All right, well, when introductions will be the true test. So why don't we kick off? Welcome, folks. Just as a reintroduction for people I haven't met, Ben Duncan, I'll be your facilitator with Kearns and West, and we're one of the consultant teams working with Department of Energy, Oregon Department of Energy, to help move this process forward. So hopefully, we'll get to know each other a lot better as we go through our time together. But it's great to see folks this morning. And I'm going to have Ruchi Sudhir open us up for some welcoming remarks, and then I'll move through some of our housekeeping before we dive into our topics today.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for joining the second advisory group meeting here today. You might notice that you don't see Edith on the screen here. I made a joke earlier that I'm wearing glasses for the very first time today so that I can take Edith's place, somehow being as smart as she is on this topic. But instead, you'll have Jessica Rikers and I kind of covering for Edith as she's on some well-deserved PTO this week. And we have a lot to cover, and we're so happy that you're here for today's meeting. And I'll pass it back to Ben.
Great, thanks, Ruchi. So I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping, then we'll introduce ourselves to each other, reintroduce ourselves perhaps. We go next slide. We are using WebEx, and I'm going to try to walk through here, but it's relatively new for me, so just give me some grace. If I miss anything, I know Odo folks, you work with WebEx quite frequently. It's similar to many platforms. Just starting on your top left, you recognize that there's you can turn your microphone on and off. There's a mute button on the bottom of your screen, so you can mute to keep yourself quiet, unmute. You have stop video, turn on and off video. And just as a note, I encourage folks as much as possible to stay on video. I recognize the many reasons that that may not always be possible, but trying to recreate the concept of being in person. You have the opportunity to raise your hand. So if you look at the reactions, raise hand button, you can, I guess if you want to send some emojis, you can send some emojis, but do so with delicacy. But more importantly, raising your hand to get in the queue. So as we go along, I'll get to know you all enough to know that I can tell when you're squirming around that you want to enter the conversation, or if you come off mute to jump in. But for the time being, in order to kind of make sure we're getting folks kind of accurately in the queue, please use the raise your hand as a way to jump into the conversation. We do have chat enabled, which is on the bottom right of your screen. What I would ask, there's kind of two pieces to remember. One, if you click on your chat, you'll see an option. I think Abby's going to be our technical support today. So if at any point you have some technical issues, you can click on chat and then click on Abby's name and enter chat for technical support. Any other chat, I'm going to ask that you use the everyone button, right? And this is, and particularly important to make sure that we're being transparent with any of our public members participating. So always use everyone. If you make a mistake, we'll copy and paste and make sure that we have public access. Any questions on WebEx or Odo? Did I miss any key pieces that seem important to name?
I think that was great. And some of us at Odo don't know how to use WebEx either. So thank you.
We're all figuring it out. So just again, if you have technical issues, just let us know. And we'll do our best to make sure that we resolve them. We can go to the next slide. And as you know, the hopes for today, in terms of our second meeting, we introduced the charter last time. I appreciate there's some folks that put forward some comments, and we'll reflect on those as we go through our that part of our agenda. But we'll also be spending some time giving you all an update on current Odo project work, some of the public engagement that's been occurring and some of the findings there. And then we'll be really getting some input based on kind of where we are collectively in this process. So at a high level, really wanting to affirm that folks are good to move forward with our charter today, give you some updates and get some input from you. And if we go next slide, in order to do that, we've constructed an agenda that, let's see if the slide moves with my talking points here. So as we go through this, we've dedicated some time for the review and finalizing of the charter. When I say finalize, I'm really getting some affirmation from you all that what's there makes sense, that you're willing to move forward, and that we're going to trust the process to kind of operationalize that charter as we do our work together. Then you'll hear from Jessica and an update, really providing a point of clarity for you all on kind of where the work is now, create a little bit of space for questions, make sure you all kind of have a solid foundation of where the work is. We'll take a 10-minute break, stretch your legs, grab some coffee, whatever is helpful for you. And then we'll close our last parts of our meeting with a conversation and feedback from you all on some of the current work and decision points that are in front of the process right now. We'll get you out of here by noon. We'll talk about next steps, how we'll spend our next meeting, and send you off on your day to do whatever is next in your life and world. Any questions around what we're trying to achieve? Questions on the agenda? Okay. So a couple notes just before we move forward, particularly for those who are joining from the public. The public can find meeting materials on the Oregon Energy Strategy Advisory Group webpage, and we'll put that link in the chat. I won't read out a long web link for you. And the links to all the materials and the project emails we'll be sharing in the chat. I'll just name that the advisory group meeting does not include public comment. So as you look at our agenda, we don't have a public comment section on our agenda, and that is intentional. We are going to talk about other opportunities and other methodology for folks to give input to this process as this work unfolds. But we've really prioritized the discussion and space for you all as advisory group members, right? So as public comment will be heard by Odo, but we're really prioritizing y'all's conversations, deliberations, discussion, and work here in the room. Let's keep going. And one of the ways that, and we'll talk through these group agreements at every one of our meetings. Some of them slides are like a little delayed, but that's all right. I'll preface group agreements because this is really, part of my job as a facilitator is to ensure that we have productive, constructive conversations. And that's going to be a theme that we're going to hear. You'll hear me say out loud over and over again, right? How do we get to productive and constructive? And one of the ways that we do that is by honoring a set of agreements that hopefully positions ourselves to really have the type of robust conversations, to embrace disagreement, right? To be candid and intentional about how we engage in our conversation. So we do, we are intentional about trying to align our objectives with our agenda. We do ask, if y'all have inputs or changes to agenda, that you bring it up. But that, we've been thoughtful about how we're trying to move through each of one of our meetings that we'll have. So we'll ask that you honor the agenda. We ask that, again, we're going to have disagreement. You all were configured because you bring different perspectives that are absolutely critical for Odo to understand, for you all to be able to be in a space where you're deliberating and listening to each other, right? So we often say, listen to understand, not just to respond. As someone's talking, really try to understand, like, why is that perspective coming through in that way, and not just trying to, get ready for your debate counterpoint. So really just listening to each other, and being candid and constructive. And again, I'll say this over and over again, to the extent that you all can find agreement, you all can find common ground, that is powerful. And at the same time, right, we recognize that we may get to places, and y'all have named some of this already, where there may be disagreements, and it's important to hold those, to respect those, to honor those, but always doing so through a respectful and candid way, in service of common ground, right? Open mind, ask clarity, try to understand the why, respect each other, seek to resolve differences, right? Again, a lot of these things build off each other. And then finally, just, for those of you, who are first to raise their hand kind of people, who are always chiming in, we'll ask that you help to self-manage. It's also part of my job. So if you're the first one to raise your hand every single time, I might call somebody else to come into the conversation first, but also just recognize for those of you who might sit back, I might at times try to bring you into the conversation. So I'm going to ask folks to push themselves in if you tend to be more quiet, and step back a little bit if you tend to be, a big talker. Again, the value of you all around this table is the insight that you offer from your different perspectives. And then, this is not a side, how do I turn this thing off? Sound. Obviously we're not in person, so the idea of a side conversation, is a little bit off for this group agreement. But that's really, how it shows up in a virtual environment is chat. So I'm going to ask that folks just have some chat etiquette. The virtual side conversations can be incredibly distracting. We don't want folks kind of having back and forth in chat. Bring it into the room, and really try to honor the space that we're creating together. Any questions or concerns about the group agreements? Okay. And again, this is, part of my job is to hold us to this, and part of our collective responsibility as folks around the table is to honor these as we go through our process. So let's move into introductions. If we go to the next slide. So I'll just kind of go around the room. We could probably we'll show the slide, and then let's take the slide down so we can see each other. But I'll ask that you just introduce yourself with your name and affiliation. I know we have some folks that weren't able to attend our first kickoff meeting. So if you weren't here last time, we'd love to just get a geographical reflection. Where in the state are you based, and what's one hope that you have for this process? So if you weren't at the first meeting, please share that. Otherwise, just name and affiliation. So let's bring down the slides. And let's start with Jeff.
Unmute myself. Very good. Jeff Hammerland. I'm a retired professor of energy policy at Portland State University. Still have a small time affiliation there as a senior fellow. My earlier meeting actually I was in northern Idaho on Treese Lake, way up at the panhandle of Idaho. I had wished I could have beamed us all up there for a huckleberry daiquiri for our first meeting. I could not pull that off. But here I'm back in Portland now, and I'm delighted to be here.
All right, now I got huckleberry daiquiris on my mind, Jeff, but that's all right. A little early in the morning for that. Laura, could I come to you?
Yeah, good morning. My name's Laura Tabor. I am the Climate Action Director with the Nature Conservancy in Oregon. Also missed the first meeting, but I'm based in Bend, Oregon, and a hope I have for the process is I guess, getting some definitive data sets that can inform policy creation, and looking forward to, yeah, all thinking about the same modeling and results specific to Oregon so that we can move forward on the hard policy conversations.
Awesome. Welcome. Thanks, Laura. Mary Moreland? You're on mute though, Mary. Haven't quite gotten that good at lip reading yet.
The double mute gets me on WebEx every time. Mary Morelands with Northwest Natural. Glad to be back for the second meeting. Look forward to the conversation.
Good to have you. Andrea?
Hi, I'm Andrea Kreiner. I missed the first meeting. I'm the executive director of the Oregon Association of Conservation Districts. I'm based in Portland, but we are a statewide association of the 45 soil and water conservation districts. And my hope for the process is to get the data and the analysis that will help us move forward to Oregon's clean energy future, not just in goal setting, but in actual policies and implementation.
Awesome. Thank you, Andrea. Brian?
I assume Brian Adams. There's a couple Brians here.
Oh yeah, Brian Adams.
All right. Brian Adams, based out of Bend, Oregon. I'm the president and CEO of Coenergy Propane, but also representing the Pacific Propane Gas Association as part of my role here.
Good. Thanks, Brian. Charity?
I'm Charity Fain, Executive Director at Community Energy Project.
All right, thanks, Charity. Good to see you. Christine?
Hi, Christine Golightly, Policy Analyst at the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission.
Thanks, Christine. Corey?
Good morning, Corey Scott with Customer and Community Affairs for Pacific Power.
Awesome. Thanks, Corey. Elaine?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Elaine Prowse with Energy Trust of Oregon, and I'm filling in this morning for Mike Colgrove, wasn't able to make it. So thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. Emily?
Good morning, I'm Emily Griffith. I'm the Oregon Policy Manager with Renewable Northwest. Thanks.
Thank you. Aaron?
Good morning, everyone. I'll hop on camera later, but can't right now. But I'm with Eugene Water and Electric Board here in Eugene, Oregon, and looking forward to continuing this process.
Oh yeah, sorry, Aaron Childs. I just realized there's two Aarons. Aaron with an E. Let's go, Aaron with the E.
It's okay. It's okay. It's good to be a popular name here. Hi, Aaron Childs, Executive Director of the Renewable Hydrogen Alliance.
Great, thank you, Aaron. Ivy?
Hey, good morning, everybody. My name is Ivy Quach. I'm with QB Fabrication and Welding, manufacturing transmission towers from all of the Northwest here. Pleasure to meet with you guys all again.
Yep, thanks for being here, Ivy. Jennifer Hillhart?
Good morning. My name is Jennifer Hillhart. I use she, her pronouns. I am the Policy and Program Director at the Oregon Citizens Utility Board, and I'm happy to be back for a second meeting.
All right, thanks, Jennifer. Jimmy?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jimmy Lindsay with Portland General Electric, and thanks for including me.
Thanks, Jimmy. Joshua?
Good morning. Joshua Bassifin, Clean Energy Program Director with Climate Solutions. We're a PNW-based climate advocacy group, and I'm based in Portland.
Great, good to see you. Nate?
Yeah, hi, good morning. It's nice to be back to the second meeting. Nate Hill, Amazon Web Services. I cover energy policy at the company, mostly focused on the West Coast and the Pacific Northwest.
Great, thanks, Nate. Patrick? Patrick, I can't hear you. I don't know if others can. Might be that double mute WebEx.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, we got you.
There we go. Sorry about that. Good morning, everybody. Patrick Mills, Climate Coordination Analyst with the Umatilla Tribes in Northeastern Oregon, chemical engineer and project manager by trade, and just looking forward to applying my relevant experience and contributing to the development of an actionable Oregon energy strategy.
Great, thank you. Robert?
Hey, good morning. Hey, Robert Wallace with Waste RC&D. We're based out of the Dalles, Oregon, but we cover programs throughout the state. Most of our work's in the rural areas with rural small businesses and ag producers.
Right, thank you. Rakesh, I thought I saw you.
I'm here. Hey,
Oh, there you are.
everyone. Rakesh Shaneja. I have the privilege of leading electric mobility for Daimler Truck North America, based in Portland, Oregon.
Great, thank you. Jen Bees, I thought I saw you. There you are.
Hi, good morning. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of issues getting my audio set up. Can you hear me?
Yep, we got you.
Great. Hi, I'm Jen Bees with Port of Portland, Director of Environmental. Nice to see everyone.
Thank you. Scott?
Assuming it's this is Scott Sims, CEO and Executive Director of the Public Power Council. We're a multi-state trade group that has all the utilities that get their power in some form from the Bonneville Power Administration. So Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, a little bit of Nevada, and a little bit of Wyoming. Sorry, I couldn't get to the first meeting. I was in Southeast Asia, so always interested to see other countries' energy systems and how they're getting by. I guess my hope for this process is that we will make sure that we're working toward policies that are clear and not conflicting with each other. I think, for instance, as we're looking at a world in which we're going to be having more energy policies, encouraging more electric use, such as electric vehicle fleet mobilization, we also want to look at what we're doing to encourage energy sources to be able to power that future. So thank you very much for having me, and I appreciate being here.
That's great. Scott, you should invite all of us next time we go to Southeast Asia for our insight and information. Tucker?
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Tucker Billman with the Oregon Rural Electric Cooperative Association. I'm our Director of Government Relations, and I just appreciate being with this group this morning.
Okay, thanks, Tucker. Shannon?
Hi, Shannon Souza. I'm down in Coos Bay. I'm an engineer and I have a consulting firm, Soul Coast Consulting and Design. We're a sustainability firm. I'm also representing two organizations that I serve on the board for. One of them is Oregon Coast Energy Alliance Network, or OCEAN. We advocate for coastal communities in the energy sector. And the other is Oregon Solar and Storage Industry Association, a trade association based in Oregon. Happy to be here.
Great, welcome. Fred?
Morning, everybody. It's Fred Hewitt, Northwest Energy Coalition. We're in the 4 Northwest states and also have members in British Columbia. I'm based in Portland and happy to be here.
Great, thanks, Fred. Let's moved around a little bit. We have Andrew. I didn't see Juan or Timothy. Did I miss anybody who is here? Okay. Well, we'll thanks folks for being in the space. Thanks for the introductions. Let's keep moving. So we're gonna continue the conversation that we started at our last meeting around the charter. And again, the charter really kind of sets out kind of the roles, responsibilities, and outlines the work that we'll all be doing together. And I appreciate, the input that some folks were able to provide between meetings. So we're going to reflect on a few things and then work through and create some space for folks that offered any input to give some additional life. But before we dive in, I wanted to kind of name a couple things, and I'm taking a little bit of liberty as your facilitator to try to outline some of my own reflections, but also really challenge us to think through kind of our charter and the space that we're going to be creating together. So I'm going to name a couple pieces up front and certainly ask that you just kind of hold it as we have our conversation. So one, as Ruchi started out today, and I know we have a couple folks filling in, and we recognize, folks are going to have vacations, and I'll be clear, we support vacations and work-life balance, so I'll just name that. And other life and work issues that arise, we're asking that you prioritize your participation. So with that said, we haven't included proxies or alternates kind of formally in the charter, but I'll just ask that you all hold the responsibility if you have someone who's going to be your backup, that they're prepared to come into the meeting, right? So while we ask that you prioritize your space, you bring specific expertise. I know you have, colleagues in your organizations that at times can come into the space. So I'll just ask that you are responsible for getting them up to speed and making sure that they're able to come in and engage in the conversation, right? Each of these perspectives that are around this table are really critical. The second, I'll just note that we didn't share comments from your colleagues around the table before the meeting, in part because we hadn't communicated that as a practice, but I'll just offer going forward that we'll plan to share any comments received from advisory group members with the rest of the group, right? So for today's purposes, you'll see what was submitted, but you didn't see it ahead of time. Just note that this is kind of the moment to give you notice that if we ask for comment, we're going to share it out with folks. So you have some transparency in terms of what your colleagues are sharing. And then just a couple reflections. So part of what I noticed in the comments were really legitimate concerns around how things like disagreements or minority perspectives, if you will, were going to be captured and represented. And just a couple things I'll note to that. One is that the process overall is designed, and part of my work and why I'm here is to ensure that we're actively and constructively deliberating and providing substantive input on decisions that Odo is going to have to make as the Oregon energy strategy is developed. And the charter provides us foundation, but I'll challenge us to really think about the reality that it's our work in the room that's going to operationalize and actualize the spirit of what is in the charter, right? And as a facilitator, I really feel it's important not to be too prescriptive about how, right? So how we'll address those challenges in the future. I will note, I think our facilitation team, Odo, is committed to documenting clearly where there's areas of agreement and disagreement and creating space in our meetings for active disagreement, for analysis, to debate policy concepts. And again, I guess I'll just offer and express that I'm confident that you all get to hold me and Odo accountable, right, to ensure that our process allows for and captures all the perspectives of the advisory group members. So I'm just going to lift up again, right, that to the extent that we find common ground and that we enter this process in good faith to try to do so is really critical. And the recommendations, of course, coming out of this group, to the extent that you find agreement, is really powerful. So I'm going to walk through the comments. I'm going to ask for those of you who did share input between meetings to give some life or some color to your comment, to make sure your colleagues really understand the spirit of what you were trying to name. And then we're going to create some space both for Odo to reflect back, but ultimately to ask you all to affirm that you're willing to go forward with the charter as proposed. Any questions or just reflections on just what I laid out? Okay. And again, I'm a process geek and very committed to the concept of like, let's grapple with the stuff in the room, and again, don't want to be too prescriptive. But let's work through some of the suggestions that we heard from folks. Again, I'll ask if that's something that you put forward, that you speak to it, so you make sure your folks around the table understand. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so the first suggestion was really focused on some of the roles and responsibilities of you all around the table. So it was a edit, an addition, and again, I'm going to ask you all not to like get stuck in the wordsmithing. Obviously, if there's like a word or a concept that is just gnawing at your insides, feel free to raise it. But again, we're trying to get the folks to say, I understand what we're doing. I have some clarity about the roles, and I feel okay going forward. So the first one was really around informing and educating communities and organizations about the development of the Oregon energy strategy, the trade-offs weighed by the Oregon Department of Energy, and the importance of a statewide energy strategy. So again, this was really focused on the role of advisory group members to really be conduits to a broader set of constituents. So I'll pause there. After noting, I do think this is something that we're going to propose that we add into our charter formally, and particularly because it identifies your role and not really speaking to the process in the room. But does anyone want to speak to, yeah, Corey?
Just a quick comment from at least my utilities perspective. I understand the adding of organization, inform and educate the organization, certainly, I play that role. But we serve hundreds of communities across the state, and I don't think the intent here is that we would be out, I'm not quite sure, communicating this through the utility lens. I don't think that's the intent of this language, but it could be read like that. So I don't know if there's a specific recommendation here, Ben, where we could get around that issue, but it does strike me.
Yeah, thanks for naming that, Corey. And so I forget who added, was it?
That was Ben, that was me.
Yeah, Aaron, jump
And this is
in.
Aaron from eWeb here. And yeah, the intent here was just, without us effectively communicating about what this document is and the role that we're playing, it could really just end up on the shelf. And I think if we, as advisory group members, also take on some responsibilities as ambassadors, that will help, bring the conversation to the public in a powerful way. Anything that is consensus among our group that we can help to educate our communities and organizations about will help sort of rally the state behind whatever consensus items we develop in the document. And I'm not wedded to this specific language here by any means. Communities and organizations seemed like a broad umbrella, but maybe there's a broader umbrella. And maybe as a final thought, I guess I would hope that the language here doesn't prescribe that we have to do this, but rather gives us license to do so. So it's more of an allowing than a mandate. But yeah, thanks for including that in this discussion.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for giving some insight into the intent, Aaron and Corey. I think your comment around like what type of expectation and obligation expectation does this bring up? Tucker, jump in.
Yeah, thank you. I do think that explanation from eWeb is helpful, but I want to second I believe it was Pacific Power who spoke up just with concerns over the number of communities they serve. From a trade association perspective, we're certainly going to inform all 18 of our members, our trade association members, of the conversations and the strategy and what we're developing here. But it's really, it would be on those members to then turn around and inform their communities. That's not something we can, ask or mandate of them. So I do think that explanation is helpful. I just wanted to second that. I would imagine there's other trade associations on here who have similar constraints.
Yeah, I'm wondering, so any other reflections on this first piece, and maybe I can offer a potential edit just in real time that might help us address Corey's comments. Any other reflections on this first piece? And then Corey, I just saw your camera go off, but I'm going to ask if it said inform and educate their communities and/or organizations, does that mitigate the kind of expectation that you'd be responsible for reaching out to kind of all the communities that you serve? Corey might have had to step away.
I'm still here, sorry. Yeah, that seems fine. And I agree. The explanation Aaron gave was totally fine with me. So I think somewhere in here there was language about, it's not a requirement, but it's you have the ability to do it. I can't tell if that's captured on the screen, and maybe it's some other language around it. So that's fix seems reasonable.
Okay, well, let's just, I don't know if we want to change the slide in real time, but if we were to add and/or, let's hold that. I'm going to ask folks that as a proposal, and then we'll kind of talk about this as a whole group. But any concerns if we added and/or, does that address, right, this obligation that you have to kind of be, I like, Aaron, your framing around being ambassadors. I think that's an important piece, but also not setting up unrealistic expectations about the work that you're responsible for. I'm not seeing any angry emojis coming up, so I'm going to assume that folks are okay with let's keep moving forward. So then there was the second suggestion was that the guiding principles overtly acknowledge the importance of ensuring that the strategy is realistic and achievable. So I'd love to offer some space to give some life to it. This will be kind of a repetitive thing. Was that Jen? That might have been you. I didn't know if you wanted to speak to. Yep, your hand's up. There you go.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to say much, and this is so obvious probably, and yet I think in this particular initiative, and it kind of goes to the next bullet here on your screen, there are some really hard trade-offs in order for this to be achievable and realistic, right? It's going to be hard. And so for us to really do the work to get to a point where we feel confident that this could actually be achievable feels important. And maybe that's overstating the obvious, but just wanted to throw it out there. Not a deal breaker for me.
Yeah, thanks for the last comment too, Mary. And then I do want to offer some reflections to your points, Jen, but Mary, jump in.
I just wanted to amplify and agree, having some, awareness of what is feasible and what is achievable is so important. And I think making a strategy that can be implemented. So very enthusiastic about that suggestion.
Okay, I hear enthusiasm. Let me reflect back and I just want to I'll offer some reflection, and I really want to open up in particularly for Mary and Jen, who just named some enthusiasm around this. So part of what I read here is what I see your existence being, right? Like that's the job that you all have in this room, right? Like I don't know if you all agree about what's realistic or what's achievable, right? It is your responsibility, right, to bring in whatever criteria and filters are important from your perspective into this space. So again, as a process person, right, for me, it's, what's realistic and achievable is what I would hope would be a robust point of debate, right? What those trade-offs are and the grappling with them in development, right? That's what we're asking you all to do. And so again, I'm gonna name that because I think it's really critical for us to just be able to embrace without being so prescriptive. And again, I'll ask my Odo colleagues to reflect back too, Ruchi, if you have other things to offer. But for me, it's like that's the work of the advisory group, right? What's realistic and achievable? That might be a filter that you care deeply about, but you might disagree about what that is. And same with the trade-offs, and that's part of what you're going to have to grapple with and give advice to Odo. But Ruchi, do you want to add any additional concepts?
No, I think you captured it well. I think that we're so glad that this group is together to help us with that phrasing. Realistic and achievable is something that we want to. We want it to be implementable. We want it to be useful for the state and for policymakers. So we appreciate your help in helping us understand what that means for you.
Thank you, Ruchi. So I guess Jen, and I know Jen, you said that it's not a deal breaker for you. Charity, I'm going to come to you, and then I do want to hear Mary back from you around kind of that reflection. We weren't proposing that we changed the charter because we kind of saw that as a process question, but I think that's part of the conversation we want to have. Let's go Charity, and then Mary, I know you said enthusiastically agree, so I want to make sure you have a chance to reflect as well. Charity?
So yeah, since we're just kind of seeing this and reflecting on it, I have some reservations with this language personally because of what you're talking about, what we all think is, I feel like those could be really interpreted very different ways. And I feel like it could be used to stop maybe more ambitious goals that are needed. So I have some reservations about this language. I'm not, with this amount of time we've had to reflect on this in this moment, I just worry that we'll be rooted in, oh, well, we can't do this. Well, we haven't tried to do it. I've been in these conversations where things have been said are impossible because they haven't been done yet. And that's used as an excuse not to do things. So I just have real reservations about this language.
Yeah, that's fair, Charity. I think, I wouldn't, as a third party objective facilitator, I wouldn't reflect it in the same way, but certainly I think that's what I want us to bring into the room, right? Like that's the deliberation and context that we'll be operating through. Andrea, jump in.
Yeah, so I would rephrase it to be that the strategy is designed to create implementable actions and policies. So those can be, or you can say goals, actions, and policies. So that it's designed not to be pie in the sky, but designed to be implemented.
Yeah, and I think that's certainly the intent. Actually don't have the charter right in front of me. But if Odo folks do, just making sure we're kind of crosswalking, because what we'll ask for is that if folks can kind of live with what's here with some potential edits, but also if folks really feel strongly about certain elements, we can come back to it at our next meeting. Any other, Mary, let me come back to you. But Richie, you just came off me. Did you want to jump in?
Oh, I just wanted to mention, I do have the charter open and I have been looking at it with some coffee this morning. And, you know, we do have some phrasing around identifying options and implementation gaps. So getting back to this sort of, I think we also realize that the strategy is only like useful if it's actionable, it's not sitting on a shelf, that we identify things that can be implemented in the state. So it's slightly different phrasing, but maybe it's behind the same spirit of realistic and achievable. But I just wanted to offer that language is in the charter.
Okay, thank you, Richie. Mary, do you want to come back to you?
Sure. You know, I think that my sentiment remains that I think it's really valuable when setting plans that they are based in the world we occupy today and aim towards the future we want to get to, rather than jumping to a future state before we have the means to do so, so that we can think about it. And I would identify, I come from the perspective of, you know, I'm representing a utility, so there's a lot of implementation and sort of the tangible world that's going to be not necessarily a constraint, but a factor in what we think is possible. So that's where I'm coming from, and I think it's a really valuable conversation to grapple with what feasible looks like from different corners of the energy conversation. So
Yeah.
welcome the conversation.
Yeah, no, thank you, Mary. And I think your last comment is really kind of sitting again as a process person, right? Like that's why this group is so powerful, right? And so critical to this process, because what, you know, to reflect back on Charity's comments, right? Like what Charity might imagine is realistic and achievable and possible, and we should implement. You know, you may reflect back some real constraints, right? Or some real challenges with what the trade-offs might be or what the barriers could be for that vision. And not to say that Charity you would go there, but just kind of holding both those things. So let's keep moving. If there's no other comments on this,
Actually, I have my hand up, if I could.
oh, sorry, Joshua, jump in.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I appreciate this conversation, and I really share Charity's concerns about this language. You know, I'm sort of struggling to understand what it is that we're kind of thinking about being, you know, realistically achievable. I mean, we have climate policies in the state, legislation, regulations, rules that guide what we need to do in order to achieve certain climate goals. And my understanding is that this strategy will create some modeling for us to be able to implement some tactics in order to meet those climate goals. And I think that part of this process of creating the energy strategy should be winnowing away which sort of tactics and mechanisms should be used to meet the climate goals. But I guess to me, that's sort of implicit in the energy strategy itself, that we would do that winnowing, and we have a model that we're going to be using to help us do that. So I'm concerned that this language would, I don't know, detract or distract from, I think, a process that we have in place that's going to create something that, you know, ultimately will be achievable because we've done the work and had the process and done the modeling to figure that out. And I also have a secondary concern about how sort of who's the arbiter of what's realistic and achievable. I think, you know, it's kind of surfaced in this discussion that could be somewhat subjective. And so, you know, I'm concerned that this language will create some subjectivity around what's realistic.
I appreciate you naming it. And again, we weren't proposing today that we include it. I wanted to have this conversation to really see kind of where folks are for that. But jump back in, Jen.
Yeah, I appreciate the conversation too, and I apologize if I have conveyed something that I wasn't intending to. I think the urgency to address climate change is so significant. It has been for a long time, and it becomes more and more urgent as days go by. And so I think it's so important, I think, with the trade-offs and looking at all of the not so exciting end-to-end supply, distribution, infrastructure investment, all the things that are perceived as barriers. We just overtly have to address all of that and figure out, like, how do we get the momentum and the buy-in and the support that we need to actually be super ambitious. So I think, listen, I think it's all in there. I'm not at this point going to suggest that we have to wordsmith anything. And I love this conversation because it sounds like maybe we're kind of all aligned, even if we are coming at it from different perspectives. So thanks
Yeah,
for the
yeah.
discussion. And I don't have a specific ask at this time as far as edits.
Thank you, John. I mean, I do think y'all are aligned and just trying to hold this distinction between, right, what the charter is and what our practice will be as we engage in the process of being an advisory body. And, you know, before I go to let's go to the next slide. But Tim, I think you joined after we introduced. Can I have you say hello? I see you looking for your mute. It's on the bottom. Yep, there you go.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to introduce myself, and sorry for missing a meeting. Tim McMahon, I'm with Stolridge Law Firm, and I'm very happy to be involved in this effort. I was distracted by a hearing up in Northwest Washington for the last couple of days, a permitting hearing. So I'm just back in the saddle. Walked into some computer problems first arrival here, but again, I'm very happy to be involved with this effort, and looking forward to participating with you all.
Great, thank you, Tim. Thanks for giving me a heads up that you joined. There's people are moving all around the screen.
Yeah.
So it's hard to see everybody in the room. So thank you, welcome. So the second set of suggestions, so the first bullet, desired outcomes of the advisory group process include documentation of the advisory group process that provides a fair and accurate record of the group's deliberations and guidance. And that's in the desired outcomes space. So why don't I just pause? And again, I'll just reflect back maybe on behalf of Odo, and Odo jump back in, that we're committed to this process. We felt like that the charter already outlines multiple ways that we're going to kind of document. And you all get to hold us accountable. We'll be creating meeting summaries. We'll be really capturing, and you all get the opportunity to say that wasn't right. You missed this piece. Can we add, et cetera? But why don't I pause? There's my notes on who said this. I don't have it in front of me. So you'll just have to acknowledge if that was you. Or if there's anything you want to add. Okay.
That may have been me, Ben. I'm trying to find where you all had sent this out to see if this is the specific slide that references kind of the concerns that or the comments that I expressed. So I think that it could have been me. I know that I had submitted feedback or comments just suggesting that I thought whatever gets submitted to the legislature, whatever gets submitted to the governor's office, should very clearly show the areas of consensus and the areas where we lacked consensus, and explore, you know, why we lacked consensus, or maybe the differences of opinions, different perspectives that were brought. And so you may have a slide in here that more specifically speaks to what my feedback was, but I just think it's important that we make sure it's very clear to the policymakers what the group was feeling on specific issues and in specific conversations, why the group was feeling that way, whatever evidence they were pointing to, and just have a very holistic picture before they make, you know, decisions that could dramatically impact Oregonians.
Thank you, Tucker. And let's carry that theme, because I think there's a number of kind of comments kind of all around this idea of kind of accurate, holistic kind of representation of the work that this group did. So that first bullet, to your point around a fair and accurate record, particularly as it's communicated to the legislature and other spaces. And then this comment that neither voting nor consensus will be required, but and all advisory group input will be considered. Member feedback will be documented in meeting notes and posted to the Odo webpage following each advisory group meeting. Odo will provide a staff response to indicate how advisory group input was considered, how it was incorporated into the energy strategy development, or why the information was not included. And then if we just go to the next slide, I'm going to just kind of walk through all of these because I think they're kind of all kind of speaking to some of the same concerns, and I just want to open it up for conversation. So then to provide an assessment of both positive and negative potential impacts that any policy or legislative recommendations may have on the various stakeholders involved. So really just being transparent about the potential impacts to various parties, to clearly highlight in the final strategy areas of consensus. And Tucker, I think this is where you were reflecting, as well as areas where there was disagreement, including relevant peer-reviewed or factual evidence provided by members in support of their perspectives. So again, as you all might provide information that can bolster or document or illustrate impacts or positive or negative, that is captured. And then finally, to declare up front that this group plans to address current and pending state policies, initiatives, and goals that may be countervailing, conflicting, or otherwise at odds, and in need of some type of alteration, reconsideration, or other steps to rectify goals and objectives that are at odds and or to reflect new data, technology, and trends. An example is prohibition on construction of new natural gas power plants and banning of new nuclear power plants. So well, I'm going to pause, right, because I think there's a lot of pieces here, and I'm going to offer, Ruchi, I don't know if you wanted to just reflect back. So one of the things I'll just name is that I don't know that we're recommending changes to the charter. And again, I'm biased because I see all of this as the charter not being so prescriptive that we can't allow our process to determine what's the best mechanism for doing these things, right? So the charter doesn't need to commit, for example, to a minority report, but we might recognize that a minority report might be a really critical aspect of our process that needs to be developed. But Ruchi, I didn't know if you wanted to provide any reflections from the Odo side before I kind of open it up to the group to really talk about kind of, is this a charter change, or are we committed to the idea that we have structures for documenting and that our process and y'all's voices will influence how it actually shows up at the end of the day?
Yeah, thank you, Ben. I'll just add that I think we want to know if you think something's missing. So when those meeting notes or when, we are providing drafts of summaries and things like that, and you see something that's mischaracterized or missing, we want to correct that. Like our goal here is to provide a fair and accurate record of this group's deliberation and the guidance that you give us. That's inclusive of when there's consensus, we can note that, but also just generally when there is deliberation and there is guidance provided, we want to make sure it's accurate. And so we might look to you to make sure that's the case. And if you see something that's not accurate, we want to, sort of make sure it's representing what you said. And so I think just going back to what Ben was saying, I think that we are generally in agreement with all of the things that have been suggested. We just want to make sure it's at a level of detail that we can create sort of process or mechanics to accomplish that as our project continues. Ben, does that help in terms of?
Yeah, I think just, there's certainly a sentiment that really capturing around folks really wanting to recognize and ensure that the conversations where we reach consensus and why, where we didn't, and where there's disagreement and why, and what are the implications of different types of decisions is captured and communicated. And I think what I'm hearing from you and I've heard from, Odo is that you all are committed to that process. What I'm asking folks is perhaps some level of not being so prescriptive that we don't create opportunities for us to figure out what that mechanism looks like. But Scott, jump in.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ben. I just really appreciate the good conversation here and the comments made by others in the other section. So I definitely can lay claim to that last bullet. That I recognize some of the words there, the countervailing, et cetera. And I think you saw that in my my representation of my hope from this process earlier today. You know, a great example, you know, we work in the hydro space a lot, but I thought I would use resources that are not necessarily in our organization's main focus, but are important for just discussion and consideration across the Pacific Northwest. And I did hear an earlier panelist talk about, you know, the impending pressure of climate change. And I would say, just again, you know, traveling around the world, I think that is a real thing that's happening right now across the globe, is the impending sort of pressure on communities, large and small, across the globe, including right here in the Oregon. And so, for example, we have a 1980 prohibition in Oregon that was a voter initiative, I believe, on the construction of new nuclear power plants. You know, there's a lot of discussion right now in small modular reactors, and in fact, you know, Department of Energy, the U.S. Department of Energy, is really incentivizing that, really looking for ways to have that developed. If we look at a car from 1980, and then we look at like the new Prius that was just issued here months ago, how vastly the technology has changed in that space. It's similar in the nuclear technology, and I'm not here to espouse nuclear technology. I'm just here to say there are developments like that we should consider in that fossil fuel free space that might be helpful in making a recommendation to the legislature. And I would just say as well, since I authored this section, there may be a countervailing narrative that we need to be considering as well, whether that's not in my backyard issues, community safety issues, you know, those kinds of things. So I just think that's going to be really helpful for us to help legislators identify what are the opportunity areas and what are the risks and benefits, so they can really have a transparent view of it going forward. So that was really the root of that was, you know, we've got all these great ideals and things we want to do in the future, but we also have some things that are kind of holding us down or potentially at odds with each other that we might need to iron out. And I think this is a tremendous opportunity to be able to do that, where we can actually make Oregon a real leader in this area. So thank you so much for the time.
Yeah, thanks, Scott, for articulating that. And Tucker, before I come to you, Richie, you just want to reflect back, because I think this policy dynamic was a really important one. And Scott, your illustration of the kind of 1981 prohibition is an illustrative example. But Richie, do you want to speak to kind of how Odo's thinking about that tension?
Yeah, I actually think that Scott is bringing up some examples of exactly the type of thing we want to talk about in this group. And while it's like a level of detail that maybe doesn't, in our view, maybe isn't right for the charter, there's actually a couple of topics in this meeting later in the agenda that goes to these sort of hard questions of thinking about current pending state policies and areas of data or technology or policy prohibitions that might feel in conflict, and how do we as a group talk about that and come up with some reasonable ways of moving forward on modeling scenarios or later in this project policy conversations. So I did want to say that, like, this is actually one of the, Scott is bringing up examples that have come up in working groups that we've been talking about internally. And I think Jessica has a couple slides later in how we're sort of starting to think about approaching that, that we're excited about talking about with you all.
Yeah, thank you, Richie. Tucker, you put your hand back down, but jump in.
Yeah, thanks. And I'm sorry to kind of belay this, but just because I did put, I mean, one of these bullet points is definitely mine. I really appreciate your comments, Ben, on the idea of being overly prescriptive and the concerns that can come with some of that. But I also think that this part of this charter is absolutely crucial to get right, because I think where the impact will be felt for Oregonians is in the recommendations that are made to policymakers. And I think I have some pretty strong concerns with the idea that we're going to leave a lot of this to the meeting notes and hope that legislators pick those notes up and sift through the subcommittee meetings on the half dozen or so topics and find every important piece of data and every important conversation and consider that adequately. I think that the report to the legislature needs to be very clear in the areas where strong disagreement occurred. I think it needs to include the relevant data to that conversation, because I would hope that this recommendation, when a legislator gets it and is considering how they should approach a policy issue, can actually reference this report and find the data that they need and find the factual evidence that they need, and also understand the varying perspectives of work group members on some of these tougher issues. I don't want to leave it to chance that they will read meeting notes. I want them to very clearly see that in the report, and so that's why I think this is so important. But I will get off my soapbox on that. I appreciate you all hearing me out on it.
No, the soapboxes are important, to use your language, Tucker. And I appreciate you naming. Let's go to Ivy, and then, I think Ruchi and the Odo team, I'd really like to kind of hear some reflection from you. I mean, I think we're in agreement that we want to capture. And Tucker, you're making some really strong points around just the how that gets captured and who the audience may be, and particularly when you're thinking about the legislature. Well, let's go Ivy, then Brian, and then I'll ask Odo to reflect back, because I want to kind of, we'll do a temperature check of kind of, are folks willing to move forward? Is there anything that we need to have and add in, and try to reflect what we've heard? But Ivy and then Brian.
I think, Ben, I think that this could be potentially a great start to a lot of the ideas that as a group we can generate off of. I think the biggest thing that I have on my end is it really comes down to what potential funding we could be looking at too, and what that's going to cost for the whole state, as a resident. And that's going to be where the community is going to be probably the biggest concern, whether that's affordable and whether that's really feasible too. So one of the things I would highly recommend is something that you can provide us. What are the current costing that we've already done, and what are the potential budgets that we have that we can actually make those decisions moving forward as a group? So that way we are making it the right decisions based on what allocation goes to what program specifically.
Yeah, thank you, Ivy, for naming that. And again, I'll push folks, right? These are the asks that as we go through this process are going to be really important, right? What is the information that you all need to have walking into a conversation to ensure that you are kind of grappling with all these different kind of realities and all this different context that exists. So Ivy, I appreciate you naming that. Brian, hop in.
Yeah, thank you. The one other thing that I would note about some of these changes to the charter that I think is important is I think whatever the group comes up with and how's it advised and once it's implemented, we saw at the beginning of this year, the end of last year, a lot of lawsuits around like the Oregon DEQ climate protection program, the gas appliance ban that started in California, that I think if we're identifying some of these areas of conflict in that all different spectrums of input is documented, taken into place, that it could help support what we come up with in court. Because I imagine whatever we come out with, there's going to be some disagreement, and there's going to be some people within the state that are going to take legal action on it. And just making sure that we have the documentation and the idea that this advisory group is heard from all the different varying views is just going to help support that in the long run, that whatever is put into place is going to be fulfilled and is going to be able to be supported.
That's great. Thank you, Brian. Ruchi and Odo, I want to offer some space for your reflection, particularly on this last point, and then I'm going to, based on that, offer maybe a path forward. Ruchi?
Yeah, if I'll work kind of backwards. Brian, I appreciate you raising that, and I think that we live in a world where that is the reality, where a lot of decisions in the energy sector do get litigated. I do want to emphasize that in this meeting and in this project, I would call it little d decisions. So, we're making decisions about assumptions in a model, data sources, policy recommendations that may turn into, a recommendation that a policy maker turns into a law, and that might get litigated. So just want to make that clarification. But I do think it speaks to some of the broader comments in the room about sort of what's implementable or what's and capturing the concerns or trade-offs in that space. The other thing I wanted to mention is, Ben has been doing a great job of sort of lifting up the charter as sort of a high level set of expectations and commitment as differentiated by specific process pieces. And part of that is that we're going to be looking to you all for some suggestions and feedback on process elements too, as the strategy develops. and as our sort of tasks with the consultants are, coming to fruition. So as an example, one thing that we have as a process piece spoken to is that we expect to share a draft version of the report with you all for feedback. And that's an example of where I was saying earlier, if you see something that's mischaracterized or is missing, we want to, that's part of the reason we want to share that draft, is that we don't want your words to be misconstrued in this setting. That's going to have to be balanced with the fact that we want to make it a usable, sort of easy to read document for policymakers, which some may argue is like 5 pages, 20 pages, 100 pages. I'm not sure what the right number is. Odo is well known for publishing 1,000-page reports, so maybe not that. We do also expect to have appendices where if there is more detail desired, that sort of, maybe that shorter, more easy to read part can jump to the appendix for more specifics. But that's an example. I appreciate you, Tucker, raising that concern. I think that we also want to make sure that we have an accurate representation of what you all are saying here. And then Ivy mentioned a few things on potential funding and the costs. And I think that's a really important driver that we're going to see in I think maybe even later today. But as it relates to both the cost around the transition to the policy mechanisms. And so some of those policy mechanisms might include some existing programs or programs that we expect that might provide some financial support. And that I think would be part of the conversation around not only sort of assumptions for the model, but when we move forward into the policy conversation, if we see implementation gaps that you all think, would benefit from some sort of financial incentive program, that's the type of conversation we really hope to have. Ben, does that kind of help with some reflection back?
Yeah, I think so. And I guess I'll, before we kind of do, and I'm going to ask folks to kind of thumbs up, I'm good to go today, thumbs sideways. I got some concerns, but I'm not going to get in the way. If you're a thumbs down, that means like I can't affirm this. And I have some real heartburn without a significant change. You have to offer that. But before I do so, I do want to, maybe Tucker, I'm going to come back to you really quickly, because I think the points that you've made are really important, and they're in alignment with, as my dad used to say, trust is only earned and it's fickle, right? So, part of this is, the charter says, documentation of the process provides a fair and accurate record of the group's deliberations and guidance. And what I hear from you, and I think some of your colleagues, is we want that to be more explicit. And I guess I'm going to start with you, particularly because you named it so clearly, because I'm sensing that's not enough, right? And so I guess I'm going to start with you, is when we say fair and accurate record, I'm sensing you want more. So let me just ask you to reflect on that, because I think that's high level. It's in the charter. I think there is a commitment. But I want to make sure that, we fully come back to what you brought into the room.
Yeah, that's awesome. I appreciate the opportunity to speak on it. I do think, obviously, we're all going to be in agreement that a fair and accurate record is key with every aspect of this. I think that there will likely be issues that will be more challenging for this group to work through, right? Likely more contentious. And I think there will be points in time where you may find a 50-50 split, or at least people that are in strong disagreement. Yep. And I think that it would just be it would be in the best interest, one, of this group, of the report, and honestly for Oregonians, if whatever is submitted to policymakers clearly reflects those areas where we lacked consensus, where there was strong disagreement, without necessarily picking a side, but just outlining the thoughts and concerns of the group on very specific topics. And I'm going to use the example that Scott threw out because he threw it out, the nuclear example. That's one. I mean, I think we all are very well aware of Oregon's history with that, and can see a world where if we were to discuss the role of nuclear power moving forward to achieve Oregon's clean energy goals, there will be a lot of spirited debate on that. There will likely be a lot of facts and data and information brought into that debate, as well as opinion. And I think that it's very important for a policymaker to have a very clear reflection of that debate, the opposing viewpoints, and some of the data that was pointed to and the facts that were pointed to, in a very holistic manner. I think about this, and if I'm a legislator, I want to pick this up. I want to read about that topic, and I want to understand how Oregonians in this work group were feeling about it and what they were saying about it, because it very well could be what informs how they vote, right? And
Yeah,
so I
sure.
think accurate and fair is awesome, but I think it needs to be holistic, and I think on the touchy subjects, it needs to be detailed and very specific.
Yeah, so thank you for that. So we're over time on this. I'm going to offer a couple possible solutions forward to see if we can get to agreement today, affirmation today, and if not, then we'll bring this back. But Ruchi and team, if I say anything that you're like, hold up, Ben, don't say that. Well, one, it'll be too late, but you can correct me. So one, I think we had a conversation earlier around the kind of the responsibility for community and organizations. I think if we edit that to say communities and or organizations, it both names your obligation and opportunity to make sure you're bringing in perspectives from your constituents, but doesn't misrepresent the obligation to like communicate to the, all of the different communities that may intersect with you. So that would be one proposed change based on the feedback. I'm going to ask for this holistically. The second piece, I think was probably the one that we just landed on. I guess to Tucker, if I was to say that it's fair and accurate, including documenting areas of consensus disagreement, right, and pulling in some of that, that's kind of a secondary piece to your piece. Would you be able to live with that? So those are the kind of two proposals to the suggested changes that I hope kind of connect to the spirit of what we heard from folks. And then for the other pieces, right, realistic, achievable, detailed, specific, right, some of those, potentially more subjective. I'm going to ask that folks trust that that's the work that we're going to do. We're going to grapple with what's achievable. We're going to grapple with, like, can we afford to do that? We're going to grapple with trade-offs. We're going to grapple with policies, all those things. So with those two changes and with a little bit of additional information connected to fair and accurate that kind of describes the particularly consensus and disagreement, I'm going to look for a thumbs up. I'm willing to go forward. I won't say enthusiastic. I'm good to go. Sideways, good enough. So there's no sideways emoji, and then thumbs down. I can't live with this. I need to bring something else into the room. So can we take the slides down so I can see everybody? Just really quickly. Jennifer, is that a question? Hand raised?
Yeah. Thanks, Ben. I'm Jennifer from CUB. Just to clarify, are we voting on both of those recommendations together, or are you asking us to vote on each individually?
Well, one, I'm going to use language to say I'm not asking you to really vote. I'm asking you for affirmation that you're willing to move forward. And it's with those caveats and additions, asking you to affirm the charter as a complete document. Is that okay, Jennifer? Is that a clarifying, or did you have an issue with one of them?
No, thank you for that clarification.
Okay, so folks, and help me team, if thumbs up mean I'm good to go, if thumbs sideways, I'm okay moving forward. A thumbs down, I need to call on you and hear from you. Okay, I'm not seeing any, I'm seeing thumbs up and thumbs sideways. Again, this isn't a vote, so we're not going to document where you were in this example. I did not see any thumbs down. Is that accurate? Okay, Ruchi, did you want to add some final comments?
No, I think this was really helpful, and I think that we'll commit to sort of making those changes that Ben was talking about and share out at the next meeting.
Great, thank you. And thanks all. I mean, I know that was a little bit of a laborious process, but hopefully it got a couple things, got your juices going in terms of how we're going to really set the stage for the work that we're going to do together. We're going to grapple with some complex things. And so I appreciate you all working through that, being flexible, willing to move forward. We're a little bit behind, but Jessica, I'm going to pass it to you. We'll hopefully make up some time as we get through the rest of our agenda.
Thanks, Ben. Appreciate it. So if you don't know me, I'm Jessica Rikers. I manage the technology and policy section here at the Oregon Department of Energy. And my group is largely responsible for the development of the energy strategy. So As Ruchi mentioned, you all might be more familiar with Edith. I know some of you, but there's definitely some people who might be more familiar with Edith. She's taking a much deserved week of time off right now. And so I get to step in and try to fill her very big shoes. So as I give the update, I plan on trying to pause for some clarifying questions. And I think what would be helpful, especially considering the limitations on time right now, is if you have a clarifying question to throw it in the chat, and between Ruchi and Ben and other members of our team, we can kind of keep track of that. And then when I pause, they can help flag those questions. Just to give you an idea of where we're at, this is meant to be like an informational set of slides. We're in the middle of the phase 1 portion of the energy strategy development, which is really about gathering data and information and to help inform our energy model. And I say our, but it's really our partners, Clean Energy Transition Institute, and their modeler who comes from Evolved Energy Research. The model will help assess. Basically, it takes and looks at what the future demand for energy will be, and then it builds in what the supplies will go, what supplies will help to achieve that future energy based on cost effectiveness. That's at a very simplified level. This model is incredibly complex, and so I'm always learning new things about it as we go along, especially through these working groups. So just a couple things to remind folks about. When we are talking about the model, we are keeping certain pieces of our energy objectives in mind as guideposts for that model. And this largely fall around existing energy policy, including the clean electricity goals for House Bill 2021, as well as the decarbonization goals that are associated with the Climate Protection Program through the Department of Environmental Quality. Okay, Gilly, next slide. So as you can see, a lot has happened since the last advisory group meeting. This is sort of our development timeline of what has occurred and what we expect to occur here in the very near future to getting to the final modeling approach. I wanted to flag a couple things I'll go over in a minute. There's 2 parts to this modeling approach, and I will cover that in the future. But in particular, we want to be able to share by September 9th with all of you, actually in advance of September 9th with all of you, what our proposal is for the reference scenario, which would be sort of our core energy scenario. So that's what we're really focused on right now. And so you can see by this timeline, we kicked off the information gathering portion of all of this with 2 listening sessions open to the public on July 31st. And then that has been followed up by a series of working group meetings, those long lists that you see during the weeks of August 5th through August 22nd, which is when we'll have our final working group meeting for this portion of the energy strategy development. And we also have developed in the middle of all this, we've developed a portal that people can submit comments on through our website. And that portal will remain open throughout the project. However, on August 31st, we'll be closing that portal for comments on the inputs to the modeling. That's when we'll stop taking comment on that, but it will continue to remain open for future processes in this project. So once we have gathered all the information from the working groups, we're going to start to compile and put that together and develop a draft reference scenario in collaboration with CETI and their modeler. And we plan to bring that to the interagency steering group on the 26th and also to the final working group meeting that will be held on the 22nd of August. And we are shooting for getting all of you that proposed draft on September 4th. It isn't quite a week in advance of September 9th, but as you can see, with comments closing on the 31st, we're going to have a rush to pull together all of that information in a way that can help inform the development of that proposed draft model. And then further out in the future, September 24th is our plan to host a webinar to talk about the modeling approach that we have agreed on. So I want to pause just right now on the timeline. Are there any timeline specific questions that anybody would like to ask? I don't see anything in the chat right now.
Yeah, so pausing for questions. Yeah, Corey, and then Laura.
Thanks, Jessica. Not quite sure this is the right time for this question, but seems as reasonable as any. I see August 31 comments on modeling. Either now or at some point through this meeting or after this meeting, can somebody provide like where all the information is to understand the modeling? I mean, great. Thank you, Jessica. You gave us the 101. That's a great start. I read everything I could this morning, but I never saw something that said, okay, you know, here's the foundations of how this modeling would work. I wouldn't know what to comment on by the end of the month.
Yep, that's a good point. A lot of that work is going on through the working groups. And those meetings are all, first of all, available on our webpage, so you can watch the recordings of those working groups. I recognize that's a big ask to listen to all the working groups. I've done it, and it's a lot. We will also have the modeler available for the meeting in September to help give sort of the final overview of how the model works and how we settled on the reference scenario. So you'll have the opportunity to ask questions directly of the modeler at that time.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. Let's go with Laura and then Jeff.
Clarifying question. On the timeline, it says for September 9th, presenting proposed modeling approach and scenarios, multiple. But Jessica, I heard you say specifically it'll be just the reference scenario that you're proposing at that time.
Yeah,
and
that's an error. Okay. We'll fix it. I apologize. I thought I caught all of them, but I forgot about this one.
And also just following up in terms of comments on the modeling, my understanding is that now is a good time to comment on what people would like to see in the other scenarios, non-reference. Is that true?
Yes.
Okay, great.
And more to come on the other scenarios. I think if you were going to focus your time and attention to Corey's point, I would focus on the reference scenario and getting us input on that. We will have an update on timeline for the alternative scenarios very soon.
Thank you, Laura. Jeff?
Sure, thank you. Can you folks hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Great, okay. My comment is regarding the closing of the online portal for comments on the modeling on August 31st. It does make sense. I know we need to proceed and we need to reach resolution for the next steps. I'm just concerned about, I will not be surprised if new information will emerge that will be relevant to this entire exercise after that date. And so I'm hoping that there's still opportunity for adjustments, revisions, new information to be incorporated after that. That's number one. Number two, I was on one of the working groups. It was the energy efficiency and load flexibility group, and also a listener on the justice group. And there were great questions, great input. What I was wondering about is there additional efforts that the modeler and Odo is looking at, making use of all the analysis that's been done by NEA and the Energy Trust of Oregon and other sources beyond those of us just happened to be on those working groups. It seemed like the modeler had great access to national data, may or may not have as much personal access to Oregon specific data coming from Odo itself, but also from NEA and the Energy Trust. So I just wanted to raise that flag of concern.
Yeah,
that's a really, really good flag. So a couple things. First, we think of the working group similar to how we think of this advisory group, that the working group members can also be our conduit for information from the working group meetings out to their organizations, out to their communities, to then gather information to feedback. That's one. And two, we do have a number of people. So for instance, we have ETO members on different working groups. So they're helping to inform with their data sets. We have a NEA member. We tried to be very broad and robust with the different working groups. And so I'm hoping we're gathering in all that information, but that's a place where the portal is really helpful. If folks have not heard about some data or information they think we need to know, particularly Oregon specific data, please feed it in through the portal. Or you can, if you know me, you can email it to me. I can get it into the collection of our information that we're receiving, whatever's easiest, especially for this team. But we can take that information and get it in there. To your first point about will there be more information that comes out after that cutoff date? Absolutely. We have a big session coming up next year, and we'll be talking about policy options when that session begins for the energy strategy. And things may occur during that session that will completely change up some of the things that we might have been talking about. And we have no control over that. But one thing that I want to remind people about, we're very focused on getting this first energy strategy done right now. But the energy strategy bill said that we will continue to update the energy strategy. And one of the things we'll be reaching out to this group and the public at large is how often should that update occur? And when should we do updates to the model to make sure that we're staying relevant, because we can't figure it out now. We don't know what's going to happen in 2040. We have some ideas, but that's an important point. So we will continue to update this work and make it relevant.
Alan, did you want to, yeah, Alan, jump in?
Yeah, a couple of points.
Alan, I'm not hearing you. I don't know if others are. Okay.
Now?
Yep.
Yes.
Directly to Jeff, your ask about NIA databases and other relevant credible databases are all going to be included in the database that we have. So those will be updating the national data that we have. Of course, they're and the base is the national data, and then we add in and Oregonize it, if you will, to make it be as relevant as possible to us. And I think that's really important. The other point to make is that modeling is an iterative process. So you run the model and you see if it makes sense, and if it doesn't, you tweak it and adjust it, and then you go back and run the model until it makes sense. And so we'll be doing that and kind of setting that reference case so it does replicate what we're doing already, and then making sure that we can then have the reference case be the base of which all the other scenarios will be based off of it, and we'll be looking at the delta between them to get the trade-offs that we've been talking about. So it's an iterative process that goes on through the entire modeling phase of the state energy.
Thank you.
Thanks, thanks for the question, Jeff. So, Jessica, we're on the first slide, so maybe we should keep moving through these. Good questions. We'll make sure that we'll follow up with some resources to your question, Corey, making sure folks have places to get more deeply informed. So thanks for that. Let's keep going now.
Thanks. I do need to make one correction. It does take a village in building an energy strategy. We are, the model will not be available at the September 9th meeting, but CETI will be there, and they are well-versed in the model. So they'll be there to answer questions. Apologies for that error. All right, next slide. So just to give you an idea of the meeting participation that we've been seeing thus far, you can see we got a lot of participation in the morning listening session. The evening was a little less, but very diverse and crowd that was really spread across the state. And with the working groups, we've had very robust engagement. Not all of the working groups have met yet. We are having our transmission distribution working group this afternoon. Buildings will be on Friday, as will a second meeting of the environmental justice and equity work group. Next slide. So you can see here, I just thought it would be interesting to see, these were the two listening sessions, morning on the left and evening on the right. The people were asked to self-locate where they were calling from in the discussions, and we had a broad swath of people from different areas of the state, which I thought was really great. And we definitely were hearing some perspectives that were not always aligned, but in some cases we also heard some perspectives that were very much aligned. So it was a great set of calls that we had. Next slide. So in the listening sessions, just to give you a taste, these are some of the things that we heard about from people on the line. They were interested in having different energy and energy related choices, such as access to different types of fuels, alternatives to cars for their transportation choices, and state support for more energy efficiency technologies. We also heard a lot of interest in how energy choices can affect communities, including job opportunities, local economic development, energy resilience, local air quality effects, and the challenges of EV adoption in rural parts of Oregon. But overall, people were very interested in what the energy strategy would mean for them and their communities. Next slide. So I'm going to dive into what we heard during different working group meetings, but I wanted to remind people about how the model works. And we had some questions come up earlier, so I can make this really short. We're working on the reference scenario, and that's sort of the core scenario for how we will then compare the other 5 alternative scenarios back to it. None of these scenarios are meant to say this is how the future of Oregon will look, or these are the decisions that Oregon will make. These are meant to be informative. They're tools for us to then see what the potential effects would be if we chose one pathway over another. So that is how we are approaching the work with the working groups. We're asking them to give us input on the data inputs and on the assumptions that are going into the reference scenario. And we're also asking them to give us some what if statements, like what if transmission is more constrained than we assume in the model? Would that potentially lead to an alternative scenario that we wanted to develop? So that's how we're focusing the working group activities. So I just wanted to give people that reminder. And we can move to the next slide, Gilly. So we have an energy efficiency and load flexibility working group. And for those of you who may not be familiar with what load flexibility is, we see energy efficiency is the ability to reduce the overall energy demand. Load flexibility is the ability to move that demand around, maybe in time or in space, to be able to manage it more effectively. So instead of having a major peak in the late afternoon, early evening, is there a way that we can move some of the demand around to help offset that big peak, which is really the driver for a lot of our electricity costs? Just an example. So this group is tasked with providing expertise on key inputs for energy efficiency opportunities in the residential and commercial sectors, such as heat pump adoption and home or business weatherization. They were also asked for input on load flexibility technologies, including the use of smart appliances and demand response programs that can be used to help consumers and utilities reduce peak electricity loads. Members included electric and natural gas utilities, energy efficiency and clean energy advocates, tribal government staff, local governments, consumer protection advocates, solar and storage developers, peer state agency experts, economic development and workforce advocates, and Oregon and regional energy policy experts. Next slide.
And a fuddy-duddy former professor.
That was in the subtext, Jeff. These are some of the high level things that they identified for us. So potential for weatherization to reduce future electricity loads, and what weatherization might mean from an equity perspective. That was definitely something that was brought up. Expectations for heat pump adoption, including what our state goals are, what federal standards exist, and technical issues that are related to the expected uptake. And in that, we also heard about jobs and workforce needs to help ensure that there's enough people out there to get heat pumps installed on the timeline that the model is showing. There was also input on the expected load reductions for different types of end uses for, say, demand response programs. And these might include things like electric vehicles and residential and commercial on-site battery storage. So when those are charging, you might be able to offset that from the peak load needs so that they aren't contributing to that peak load. That's the kind of thing that demand response would do. And flags on how uptake on energy efficiency and resources that do enable that load flexibility might affect energy burden and equity considerations, especially in the adoption of technology. So can we afford to put a heat pump in a home if that upfront cost is too high? Those kinds of equity questions. So that was our energy efficiency and load flexibility group. I'm going to work through these slides on the different working groups. If you have questions, throw them in the chat, and when we get to the end, we'll open it up again. So next slide, Gilly. So we had a work group that was looking specifically at electricity generation technologies. And lost my slide. The work group was tasked with providing expertise on key inputs and modeling assumptions for electricity generation resources that will help us meet future energy needs. And these include looking at things like hydropower, wind, and both utility scale and rooftop solar. The members of this group included electric and natural gas utilities, energy efficiency and clean energy advocates, tribal government staff, local governments, consumer protection advocates, developers, state agency data holders, economic development and workforce advocates, and other Oregon and regional energy policy experts. Next slide. So the key inputs that this group identified included uncertainties around load growth. They in particular said that the degree to which or the rate at which we electrify will have a lot of implications for what the future load looks like. And there are certain uncertainties also around the future of transmission. So even if you can build the renewable resource, if you can't get the power on the grid, that will be a potential constraint on how quickly those can come online. And one note that they brought up there was that there are a lot of transmission-focused studies that are happening right now. None of those studies will be available to inform the work going on in this energy strategy. So that gets back to the question that Jeff flagged earlier. And that's just the nature of how time works, unfortunately. They also indicated there's uncertainties around how we set the reference scenario, in that will we set the reference scenario, what degree of electrification we set in that will have implications for what we might want to look for as a degree of electrification in an alternative scenario. So that means that, for instance, if the reference case scenario had pretty high electrification increases on the system, that means that we might want to look at an alternative scenario that had less electrification on the system to see what the differences in costs might be, or vice versa. So that dependency was flagged. The group discussed concerns on how siting constraints might affect the development of resources, especially solar, and then the transmission to bring the resources to the grid. And that potentially we might need to have an alternative scenario that looked at higher investments in demand side resources to help address that constraints around those things. They also discussed other what if scenarios, like looking at small modular nuclear reactors as an electricity resource, and what if we prioritize assessing effects on jobs from different energy pathway choices. And I will note that the small modular nuclear reactor, this has been brought up in several areas, and well, it's something that, as far as the state of Oregon goes, we can't be building that in Oregon, but the model does look at small modular reactors across the Western United States. So that's something that this working group has been thinking about as they've been talking. Next slide. So then we have a direct use fuels and industry working group. They were tasked with providing expertise on fuel and technology options that can meet future heating and industrial energy needs, while also achieving the state energy decarbonization targets. Members included natural gas and electric utilities, energy efficiency advocates, clean fuel and environmental advocates, consumer protection advocates, Oregon business and industry advocates, state agency data holders and experts, economic development and workforce advocates, and other Oregon and regional energy policy experts. Next slide. So this working group looked at cleaner fuels and technologies and really focused a lot of their discussion around when the actual availability of these fuels and their infrastructure might actually be there, and what limitations of existing technologies might require a longer adoption timeline in the reference scenario. And I think this gets back to some of the flags that we were hearing about during the charter discussion. What is achievable? And there was a lot of input on this, and understanding and being able to rely on data sets about things that are way far out in the future was definitely something that the group had robust conversation around. They also discussed that this particular working group, or this particular area of the energy sphere, would have a lot of influence from broader national and Canadian energy markets. And that will influence the ability for Oregon to adopt these new technologies, new fuels. We currently import most of our direct use fuels, and the group did not see that there was any reason to believe that that wouldn't be the case, at least in the nearer term of the energy strategy. They also discussed the relative dependence on regional development of things like clean hydrogen or renewable natural gas and different biofuels on Oregon's ability to bring these fuels into their own market. And the members of the group expressed interest in how the energy transition might affect investments in the physical infrastructure that exists today, and also what influences it might have on workforce needs across the state. Next slide. All right, transportation. This working group was tasked with providing expertise on clean fuels and vehicles and technology options that can meet future transportation energy needs while achieving state energy decarbonization objectives. The members included electric utilities, clean fuel and environmental advocates, consumer protection advocates, transit organizations, local government representatives, Oregon transportation business and industry advocates, state energy experts, economic development and workforce advocates, rural and urban community representatives, and other Oregon and regional energy policy experts. Next slide. So this working group really focused a lot on the timing. This is something we heard in the direct use fuels group. Transportation also had a lot of concerns around the timing of the availability of, for instance, zero emission vehicles, different types of alternative lower carbon clean fuels and clean fuels in general, as well as the infrastructure that might be needed to support all of them. Discussions focused around the anticipated availability of clean vehicle models, especially electric and hydrogen versions of medium and heavy duty trucks, and when and how much lower carbon fuels like renewable natural gas and ammonia and hydrogen might show up in the model, like the timing around that, and for what types of transportation vehicles those might be appropriate. They also discussed the role of lower carbon fuels like renewable diesel, particularly in the near term when zero emission vehicles and infrastructure aren't as prevalent or ready to be commercialized. In addition, the group discussed concerns about the feasibility of increases in electric load resulting from larger vehicle electrification. And finally, the group discussed how to incorporate vehicle miles traveled reductions into the model. And there are various ways that they could do that, which, as you may know, there are goals to hit a VMT, 20% reduction in VMT by I'm going to get the year wrong, sometime around 2040, 2050. And those come through the statewide transportation strategy that the Oregon Department of Transportation put out, as well as DLCD's climate-friendly, equitable communities work. Next slide. The next working group focused on land use and natural resources. This group, as well as our environmental justice and equity group, this was a deeper dive. We had to sort of peel off the layers of all the energy information to really dig into what that meant for land use and natural resources. So I feel like they had a big lift in this group. They were tasked with using their expertise and experience on existing land use policies and interests to provide feedback on data and assumptions and how we balance energy with environmental, economic, and societal interests. They were focused on providing feedback on land use and natural resource screens or filters for the energy strategy, and the inputs that could shed light on the effects of different land use policies on the energy transition costs and timeline. Members of this group included electric and natural gas utilities, environmental advocates, local government representatives, non-energy land use advocates, renewable energy developers and advocates, state agency experts, rural community representatives, and other Oregon and regional energy policy experts. Next slide. So this working group focused a lot on how the model would include those screens or filters that would involve reasonable assumptions on potential land availability for future energy project development. And this was based on natural resource and land use data layers. Many of you might be familiar with work that Odo led with some of our other peer agencies called the Oregon Renewable Energy Siting Assessment, or ORESA. Some people call it ORESA. We developed a tool that you can look at today that has map layers on different land use perspectives. It's really fabulous and cool, and I can't recommend it enough, especially if you are a nerd like me. So that was a preferred method for doing some of these screens for a lot of the folks on the call. But it's simply within the budget and timeline that we have, we can't replace what the model currently uses for those filters. So what the model uses is the Nature Conservancy's Power of Place data and screens. And so what the discussion focused on a lot, especially in the first meeting, was how could the screens that exist in Power of Place mimic or be similar to the ones that are available in their ORESA tool. So we were looking for ways to true those up without having to rebuild that portion of the model. So that was one piece of it. And then recognizing this group, recognized that there's challenges in development needs. So they discussed whether the feasibility of modeling more investments in rooftop solar to offset land use needs might be something of interest, and what the potential equity issues might arise from policies that would put that in place. They also wanted to understand the effects of load growth on future energy needs and how modeling growth in things like air conditioning and data centers might affect the potential impacts on rural communities and whether there would be associated benefits to those rural communities. They were also interested in what the reference case might use as constraints around renewable development, if any, and if the model could focus renewable energy development on areas where development was less controversial, like brownfields or already disturbed lands. Next slide. All right, so the last working group that I am covering in this section of the meeting really focused on environmental justice and equity. They also had to dive into the modeling inputs to tease out how the model could help them understand what the benefits and costs to their communities might be in different energy transition scenarios. So as they dug into the model inputs, they were assessing whether the model inputs could help also provide insight on things like energy burden or disparities across geographic locations, homeowners and renters, like are there differences in how they would be affected by these different pathways to get to our energy goals. Rural and urban geographies, there's definitely a different perspective on the load sources being in generally the Willamette Valley, whereas many of the resources are being built outside of the Willamette Valley. And general access to clean energy technologies and resources. What might that look like for environmental justice and disadvantaged communities? The group also wanted to understand what the granularity capabilities of the model were. To see if it could help them to dig deeper into some of those disparities and get more specific. So understanding the different effects on, say, rural Oregonians living at the coast versus rural Oregonians living in Eastern or Southern Oregon, or even the rural areas that exist in the Willamette Valley. And they also will be meeting again on Friday. So I'm only giving you part of what they've already discussed. We're going to dig into some of these topics a little deeper and identify other things that they think would be of interest. So We will be sharing the recording of that meeting on our website. It should go up by Monday. So if you want to catch some more information about that, it will be available then. So I will pause and see if there were any questions, clarifying questions about the working groups before I finish up.
There's nothing in the chat yet, but I did earlier on see Brian's hand go up and go back down. So I just wanted to make sure there wasn't a question there.
Yeah, no, thank you. I was a little bit unclear about the original participation, if that was the members of the working group or if there's any data around the public participation number of people that listen in on the group as well.
You know what, I don't, those numbers that we put up there included not just the members, but also members of the public who tuned in, but I don't have them separated. In general, there were probably about anywhere from 2 to 6 people on each of those calls that were members of the public.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Thanks, Richie, for identifying the hand. Any other clarifying questions? I'm not seeing any, Jessica. Why, for timing, why don't we just keep going? And folks, feel free to add questions in the chat if they come up for you at all.
Actually, I'm trying to raise my hand, but it's not
Jeff,
working.
there you are. Yep.
Very quickly. So I was an attendee of the environmental justice one. I think the most important takeaway that I got from that I wanted to pass on to this group is that a pretty strong feeling that that environmental justice sorts of issues need to be thought about, considered in every working group, as well as this advisory committee, that it shouldn't be ghettoized into one group. It should be, it made sense to have an environmental justice group. There wasn't concern about that, but also that that lens needs to be incorporated in all of our working groups in an entire effort. So that was an important takeaway for me.
Yeah, thanks for that reflection and modeling for your colleagues around the table that there are opportunities to listen in to many of the different conversations that'll be happening around this body. Thanks, Jeff.
And I'll just add that Jennifer Hillhart added in the chat. Did she be interested in hearing more on how an EJ lens is being applied in each working group? We're focusing questions for the working groups to include environmental justice perspectives that they've heard about, or pinging on things that Odo has heard about. And we're also working to filter some of that information, well, as much as we can, all of it, back to the environmental justice working group. But that's occurring more in the second round that's happening on Friday, because obviously they were in the middle of all the other working groups occurring.
Yep, thanks, Jessica. Andrea?
Yeah, so following up on the question about the public, so we're considered members of the public when we attend the working groups. Do you have a sense of how many of those public members were us versus truly public members, like people who are not otherwise involved in this process?
No, that's a really good question, Andrea. You know, I don't have a sense. I did definitely see people from other groups. And in fact, my next slides are going to kind of elucidate what those groups are. But there were definitely people I didn't know the names of. And so I think that there were at least some. But we could probably tease that out and get that information available before our next meeting, if that's of interest.
Yes.
And that's something we can try. You know, there'll be listening sessions throughout this process that we'll also probably want to do some delineation, if I'm hearing that as a point of interest of kind of who's the who's who that's kind of already engaged in this and tracking, and members of the quote unquote public who aren't kind of directly involved in the process. Alan?
Yeah, our Josh did analysis of that when we were doing it. It was less than a handful.
Yeah, so limited at this point in the process. Not seeing any more hands for the moment. Jessica, why don't you keep going, because I know we're a little crunched in timeline.
We're behind, but we're going to get through.
Yes.
Okay, so this very busy slide is really meant to kind of show process. And I think that's an important piece, because there's so many moving pieces that sometimes even I have trouble keeping all of them in track in my brain. So a lot has been happening, as I mentioned, since the last advisory group meeting. And I just want to flag an acknowledgement. The timeline is compacted, and we recognize this and appreciate everyone's efforts to make sure that we are that they're able to engage in this really short timeline. And just to flag, the reason behind this is that we have a time limitation on when we can have access to the modeler to be able to do the modeling that goes with this. And so we're trying to hit a date of September 10th to finalize the modeling, at least the reference scenario modeling inputs, so that that modeler can start to actually develop the model. These models take days to run, so it's a lengthy process. So bearing this in mind, that we didn't have a lot of time, I think what we chose to do was to go with breadth of information and ways to provide input to Odo. And that's what you're seeing here. You'll notice that on the left-hand side of your screen, there are 5 different ways that you can provide input into this process. The first is our steering group. The steering group is peer agencies who we work with, and their focus is to make sure, one, we're aligned with the policies and programs that they operate or that they have oversight on, and also just to ensure that we have good, solid Oregon-specific data where they have data that can help inform the model. Working groups I just covered, they are very important to the technical expertise, the lived experience expertise that can help inform the modeling inputs and assumptions. And if you aren't a member of a working group, you can access people who are on the working group to give them your feedback and your information. And those working group members are hopefully going back to their communities and organizations to get some of this information to filter back. And we expect a lot of the working groups will continue throughout this process into when we get to the policy discussions. So that is a really important piece of the puzzle to make sure that people are engaging in different ways. Similar to the advisory group, all of you here and your role in especially helping us when we get to those sticky, challenging things where people don't align, they don't agree, and we need input and perspectives on things to help inform the final energy strategy work. And then people can tune into the listening sessions and the webinars that we're going to be having. That's open to the public. Everybody can join that. And then we'll have that public comment portal open throughout the process. There will be deadlines on specific items that we need during that time, but it will be open throughout until we get to the end of this first energy strategy. And I see Elaine asked a question in the chat, how we're going to summarize each working group, all their input and how it was integrated in the modeling. That is, it's like you read my mind. That is the big teal colored circle right there that you're seeing in the middle of this slide. We have to pull all that information together and synthesize everything that we were hearing through all of these platforms and start to build how each of those fits into the reference scenario assumptions and data inputs, and where they don't, why not? And I'm going to share a decision-making slide criteria here in just a minute that will kind of inform how we go about some of that. But that is the core of what we're going to be doing over the next 2.5 weeks. So we're going to be very busy behind the scenes of all these other meetings that are happening. And what will come out of all that synthesized information and data that Odo and CETI and the modeler put together is a draft reference scenario. And that scenario will include data sources. And things that I flagged here are things that I know are already built into the model. And Alan was flagging some other things like the NEA cost assessments and things like that. But there's other data sources that we're hearing about, and we're looking at how we can include those in the reference scenario. So that information will be much more detailed that we'll be providing to you all. And also what the assumptions are in the model. And again, the assumptions that I've listed here are the ones I highlighted up front that are things that are in existing state policy that we are bringing to the modeling, the reference scenario for the model. And next slide sort of looks at what the next steps are going from there. Once we have that draft reference scenario, we'll be posting it online so that people can see it and provide comment on it. We'll be sharing it with working groups on August 22nd and getting their input on it. We will be sharing it with our steering group on August 26th to get their input on it. And we'll be sharing it with this group. Like I mentioned, we want to get it to you in advance. We're estimating about September 4th to get you the you'll be able to see the draft scenario when everybody else can, but we're incorporating the input from the working groups and from our steering groups. So you'll see what our finalized product looks like by September 4th. And again, we will take all of those final inputs that we're getting, synthesize all that information with CETI and the modeler to develop the final reference scenario. And then last slide, second to last slide, we're almost there. If you'll move forward, Gilly. And we'll be working on alternative scenario development. As I mentioned, we're trying to figure out a timeline for that, giving people a little more time to focus on that so that we can get the reference scenario in place and get the modeler going on that. So we will get you that information very soon. And you'll know the timeline on that here shortly. Next slide, last slide. So decision-making criteria in advance of starting to pull all this information together and knowing that there are going to be places where we have to make decisions on what should be in the reference scenario and what can't be in the reference scenario, and where there are places then that we don't have broad alignment from the working groups. Those are things where these might end up coming to you in the September 9th meeting and having a discussion about those areas where there's not great alignment. But in general, we have this decision-making criteria that we want to use up front. And the first, it's sort of built into two buckets. The first bucket is, what are our established modeling constraints? We know that we have to achieve state energy objectives and include greenhouse gas emission goals. That would be something that would say yes or no to a modeling input request. Energy system reliability. The model is designed to make sure that we have as reliable a system in the future as we do today. So that means that we have to we can't have choices that would make the system less reliable than it is today. And then last, the existing policy that I already mentioned. If it's outside of existing policy, then that would be a no. And then the other considerations that we would have would be data availability, and if we don't have the data to inform something that people are interested in seeing, that might have to sit as a, this would be great to model, don't have the data, how can we go get the data before the next time we do the model? Or if there's a choice between something that would inform a near-term energy policy decision versus informing a later-term energy policy decision, there's probably more weight put on things that are more near-term decisions because those become more critical. So that's our criteria. And I wanted to share it with you first to know what our thoughts are and how we'll work through this, but also that I think this might be useful criteria for everyone in this group as you work through discussing the different places where we don't necessarily align particularly well. And if you have anything you'd like to share on this, please feel free to throw it into an email to me or to Edith, and you can put it into our comments portal. All of that will get to us one way or another, and we're happy to help build on this. But this is our guideposts, at least at this moment in time.
Great. So keep throwing questions in the chat. We are a bit behind, but if there's any burning questions based on what Jessica just presented, let's bring them into the room now, and then we'll take a break. We do have a couple more topics that we're hoping to get through today. So Joshua.
Yeah, thanks. I'll be quick. First of all, this is a ton of work. I just want to recognize that how much Voda has put into this, and staff have just like the amount of time and resource. And so thank you for doing all this. Also, this first tranche of working groups has been a real whirlwind. It's all been packed into 3 weeks, which, I recognize that was necessary to get that output from the working groups in order to get those modeling assumptions going. And I'm wondering, do you foresee activating the working groups in the future after this first tranche of meetings?
Well, I can't give you a date on that because we have been so focused on, as you said, getting all of this work done in the next few weeks. But once we get through the work to get you all the reference scenario information by September 4th and get the preparations for that meeting put together, we're going to sit back and think about what those working groups, where we might want to be bringing them into the discussion going forward. There is going to be a break in the activity while the modeler goes off and does his thing. And that's going to be an extended period of time. It'll be from the time that we give him the go on the alternative scenarios, which will decide a little later than the reference scenario. And then probably sometime in about early to mid-December, we're going to have results. So there's going to be a break in there. And so I don't know what we're going to do within that break time. It feels like a really good time to bring about some information that people might want to know in advance of the discussions around policies. So stay tuned is all I can say on that. And if there are needs out there that you're seeing to help inform next steps, absolutely reach out to us. We're happy to hear them.
Yeah, thanks, Joshua, and thanks, Jessica, for that response. I mean, it's a structure that's been built that could be activated, but I appreciate the kind of timeline that you're describing, Jessica. Any other burning questions? Otherwise, I want to send us on a 10-minute break, but it's like, who's going to ask the question that gets in front of our break?
Well, I think there's one in the chat here from Aaron. That's a good one to maybe have Jessica address.
Yeah, so consideration of doing some modeling that allows for reduced reliability to see the details of the trade-off.
Yes, I saw the question. I was going to respond in the chat, but I'll be quick. And then Aaron, if you have follow-up, send me a chat and I'll respond. So right now there aren't plans for that, but if that's something that you think would be valuable, I definitely think you should get in and send a comment through the comment portal that you think that would be of value. That has been one of our guideposts. So I don't want to give the impression that it's something that we would necessarily say, no, we're not going to do that anymore, but we want to hear that if people think that that's something that's important to consider.
Awesome. Okay, well, let's keep using the chat if something comes up. Let's take 10 minutes. We'll come back at 11:16, and then we're going to move into a conversation reflective of the memo that hopefully folks had a chance to digest around this deliberation for Odo around scenarios with more ambitious targets. So let's come back at 11:16, and yeah, we'll see you in 10 minutes. Okay, we start making our way back. If folks can do a thumbs up, some kind of camera on, thumbs up, some mechanism to know that you're here with us, that'd be great. We got a little leg stretch. Okay, so let's move on. So we're going to move into a conversation building off the memo. Thanks, Richie, for throwing it back in the chat. So I'll pass it to you to lead us off.
Yeah. Well, welcome back from your break. So I put in the chat, like Ben said, the memo that you should have received. And I'm just going to walk through just some of the highlights in case you want to refresh your memory. And I think it would be good to just take the slides off because I didn't put the memo into the slides. So the intent here is to just make sure you're familiar with what the memo said and really wanting to have a discussion among you. So that's I'm putting you on notice. That's why we're showing you all each other's faces, I guess. So we're bringing a question to the advisory group for some feedback on if one of the 5 alternate scenarios, not the reference, should include a more ambitious economy-wide greenhouse gas emission target than the target that's set forth in Executive Order 20-04. So a little background on that. You know that HB 3630 asks ODA to develop an Oregon energy strategy that identifies pathways to meeting the state's energy policy objectives. And, you know, as background, most of us probably are familiar with, and if not, we can send you some more information on some energy policy objectives that are pretty well known in Oregon. One is HB 2021 around clean electricity targets. Another is the Climate Protection Program, emission reduction goals for fuels, and then anything not covered in those two kind of defaults to Executive Order 20-04 carbon reduction goal of 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. HB 3630 also states that the energy strategy must be informed by stakeholder perspectives, state laws, policies, and targets regarding energy and greenhouse gas emissions, state policy objectives, and energy-related studies and data analysis. You know, a big reason that you all are in this room and why we're bringing this question to you. But I think it's important to note that in addition to the bill, the development of the Oregon Energy Strategy is actually funded by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency through the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant, or CPRG. And the Oregon Energy Strategy is part of the state's comprehensive climate action plan. And in the program guidance for the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program, US EPA directs that the state comprehensive climate action plan should not be inconsistent with federal commitments to reach net zero emissions by 2050, and that states with existing targets like Oregon are encouraged to update, modify, or expand on their targets as appropriate. In addition, we've heard interest in several of the Oregon Energy Strategy meetings in using one of the 5 additional modeling scenarios to assess a more aggressive decarbonization scenario. But we've also heard concern about the difficulty in meeting our existing targets and a preference for focusing on existing targets. Oregon's existing emission reduction goal of 80% below 1990 levels is not in line with current science. If you consider the International Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, found that a net zero emissions by 2050 is needed to meet 1.5 degrees Celsius limit on global temperatures and prevent the worst outcomes from climate change. And the Oregon Climate Action Commission recommended that Oregon update emission targets to 95% below 1990 levels by 2050. They also recommended that the state adopt net zero goals as soon as practicable. So that's the background that I wanted to make sure you saw in the memo. We really want to hear from you what you think about whether a what-if alternative scenario with a more ambitious target could help policymakers better understand changes in Oregon energy systems that would be necessary to achieve a more ambitious target. So that's really what I wanted to make sure you all read in that memo, and really wanted to open it up for some feedback and discussions.
Great, thank you, Ruchi. So this is, one of those moments that we're going to have as a body. We're not seeking to come to any level of consensus, but really try to understand the different perspectives around this table and to really fulfill your role as an advisory body. So with Ruchi's question on the table around using one of the 5 model scenarios for a more ambitious target, just open it up for reflection, feedback, support, concerns, et cetera. All right, Scott, lead us off. Thank you. And then
Well, I guess the lack of other folks speaking up. So I would say we've got our hands full with the scenarios that we've got on the table right now. Just understanding the landscape that a lot of our utilities face in the Pacific Northwest. We're really lucky as a part of the country compared to other parts of our country in terms of just the overall amount of renewable resource we have right now, and we're still struggling to sort of find that balance between economical, reliable, and not leaving folks behind, as well as addressing emissions needs. So I feel like the scenarios that we have, I think it'd be difficult, I think, for us to envision more aggressive scenarios. I know there's folks from the natural gas community that are on this call, and a lot of our folks in our industry continue to talk nationally about natural gas being a bridge fuel until we can get to some of these other emissions-free scenarios. I know that's not popular, but I think there's practicality that we have to figure out. So one of the places to sort of take the heat out of the conversation, I think, is to look at what's happened with California and aggressive climate policies that they have tried to advance in California that they've had to actually retrench on. And they've actually installed a fair amount of diesel gensets, and there are natural gas units that are, I think, labeled as hydrogen ready for the future. But they've also, stopped the closure of some of their specific critical plants in California because they're trying to meet targets, but they're also realizing that the practicality of getting there can be difficult. So I'm just sharing that as we've got our hands full with what we've got on our plate right now. The weather certainly is producing anomalies. I mean, we just saw January was a very, very cold event, and we just had a very hot event. Was it June this year? Those extremes are reminding us that we can't lose our vigilance. At the same time, we don't want to, I think, exceed what's practical or capable. So happy to define that more, but I don't want to take up all the space. Thanks.
Appreciate it. Thanks for kicking us off, Scott. Let's go Elaine, then Tucker, then Charity, then Laura.
Yeah, so this raised a question for us because it does essentially change the objective function, of that scenario, and it's not aligned with the other scenarios. So more of a, from a study approach, a study definition of the meaningfulness of having one scenario with a different objective and what we can learn from that. So that was maybe just raising it as a concern for, our time or focus being put in that direction. And maybe an alternative is when we do revisit the energy strategy, that this is more of a phase 2 objective. So just another idea to offer there, but more of just, what can we learn from it that's meaningful if there's one pathway that is implied in having one scenario. That's our question, really.
Okay, thank you, Elaine. Tucker.
Yeah, I think the prior two speakers said it well. One thing that comes to mind is just, it had already been talked about earlier today, that we're limited with our access to the modeling and the modelers, and we have a kind of a limited time window there to do that. So I think it makes the most sense to focus on the mission that's already been given through the Oregon legislature and the targets that have already been given, and utilize our time and resources toward that end. And I'm not entirely sure I understand what we gain at the end of this if we look at something else. So that's just my 2 cents, but I think the other two said it better than I could have.
Yeah, thanks, Tucker. Charity, then Laura, then Jeff.
I guess I disagree with the people who've gone before. I think if we're studying and researching and modeling, that looking at a model that looks at something more aggressive has value, and that in that process, if your concerns about affordability and reliability and cost, and the other things you brought up come up, then that would come up in some kind of analysis. And that we shouldn't sit here at this point and be like, oh, we don't want to deal with something more. Like climate goals are taking action is needed, and what does it hurt to like look at those scenarios right now while we're doing that and modeling. So I would support looking at something that pushes us beyond maybe what we're already talking about, and not get into the weeds right now about, oh, can we do this or not this? Like, we use that as an excuse all the time about why things haven't already happened. And if we'd been having this conversation 30 years ago, it would be a different conversation, but we don't have time left to worry about some of the things. So I support that.
Okay, thank you, Charity. Laura?
Yeah, I think we should definitely be keeping this on the table. And I'm remembering that the Oregon Climate Action Commission, in its most recent modeling, did look at scenarios with higher emissions goals. And I believe some of the findings from that analysis were showing increase in net benefits over time. I also think that, to the point Charity just made, we're not going to kind of know the difference between those scenarios and what feels more or less possible if we're not analyzing it. That said, my understanding is we have up to 5 alternative scenarios to work with. And so I think the question is, can we answer what's the sort of set of alternatives that's going to answer all the questions that we want to answer, including what does it look like to try for more? And just thinking, I don't know where it leaves Odo and your obligations in terms of the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant funding if we don't analyze that scenario at all. So I think, want to stay open-minded about what that looks like and how we can make it the most useful to our conversations. I think we need to have it in the mix in some form.
Thank you, Laura. Jeff?
Okay, so wearing my academia hat here for a moment, I also would agree, I recommend that we include a very aggressive scenario as one of the 5. It's not the only scenario. Of course, if it was the only scenario, I would think that would be ridiculous, but we're looking at a range. We're looking at the JAWS, as the Northwest Power Conservation Council talks about it in terms of their scenarios. And I think we need to have one that's really quite aggressive, that tests the bounds of what we can pull off and identifies the barriers that would be involved in that. So we could certainly incorporate the experiences we've seen in California and how California is addressing that. That seems entirely appropriate to me, to have the full range of scenarios included.
Thank you, Jeff. Let's go. Andrea?
Yes, thanks. I need to leave in a minute. So I'm going to give you my 2 cents here, is that I also believe we need to include a more aggressive scenario and not wait for the next update to the strategy to look at the more aggressive scenario, because we won't be able to evaluate what we should be doing, right? We know we need to meet more aggressive goals just for the climate purposes. So why would we not evaluate that and see what would it take? And then you can make informed decisions. If we don't evaluate it, we can't make an informed decision, and we're not going to push ourselves forward to get to where we could get. And as Laura said, a lot of those scenarios include greater benefits in the long run. So if you start looking at that, you look at the payback for future generations.
Thank you, Andrea. Tucker, your hand was up and then it went down.
Yeah, I was just going to briefly say that I think, this is one of those instances where there's obviously a broad range of perspectives. I think one of the benefits of sticking with the legislative direction we've been given is that it kind of helps us work our way through some of those broad perspectives and gives us kind of a common direction. And I would also say that I think there are probably some on this call who think that the targets we've been given are considered quite aggressive targets. And so I just would offer that for thought as well. But that's my last kind of 2 cents on it. Thanks.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And, this is going to be likely an ongoing challenge around language, ambitious, aggressive, right? There might be disagreements in that, but thank you for naming it, Tucker. Ivy?
Yeah, I need to jump off soon here, but I think this is kind of like a great start for all of us to kind of start scrubbing or start at the very surface level at least, and then we can get more granular. But I think overall, this group, this advisory group, or however it's going to be turning out, will definitely need to be on board probably for a while. It's not just going to be only within 2 years. I think that because everything is expected by 2035, zero emission, things could change within the next decade or so, or however it's going to be at the pulse at the Oregon residence level too, and the cost of it is astronomical to most people probably, especially in the rural areas. So you definitely want to keep in mind about the cost and how to manage cost, which is going to be cost efficient in the long run for the folks down the line. Either it's going to be in the metro or the rural area, because if we're increasing more programs for EVs, solars, wind power, and now we're talking about offshore wind, these types of very high buzzwords for the public here, and we don't have the transmission line, we don't have grid resiliency on that when extreme weather comes down, it's going to impose a lot of issues that's going to cost more to us down the line if we don't have that built. And then there's talking about, on the Biden administration about safeguarding infrastructures too with that. So there's a lot of components, I think that we got to scrub off, but I think for long term, as we as a group keep talking about these things, it's not just like a 1 to 2 year thing, but for a long term planning, and we evolve it, we finesse it. I think we can definitely get that target though. It may be not exactly what we all wanted, but definitely something where the community is going to agree with that.
Yeah, thank you, Ivy. And then Jen Bees, you had put in the comment in the chat around I can't say opportunistic. Sorry, for going with me there. Do you want to just kind of speak to how does that relate to that? Are you saying we don't need to do the ambitious scenario because we can look at other scenarios and then build up on top of it?
Well, I put that chat before a lot of people commented, so I would say that's kind of a middle of the road approach to take. I guess I would be a fan of being more ambitious, again, just because there's a lot of urgency here. And I think there are multiple ways to get there. So I think, I guess I'm flexible now that I've heard a lot more kind of commentary about it.
Thank you, Jen. And then Alan, I see your comment in chat, just kind of maybe solidifying or providing a little bit of clarity around what the ambitious scenario would do, and it's consistent with other recommendations. Anything to add from that, Alan?
No, I think you got it there, Ben.
Okay.
It's just that it does give you, it's not the driver of our recommendations or the state energy strategy, but it does allow you a peek into what a more ambitious scenario would take, kind of actions we need to take in order to get there. And that's so it's more informative and interesting and setting us up for potential future looks at this later if that should become the goals.
Great. Thank you, Alan. Any other comments on this? We do have one more discussion that we're hoping to have with folks that kind of ties back to some of our earlier conversation around transparency and communication and kind of meaningful structures for engagement. But I don't want to move off of this if folks either have a perspective that they're wanting to share or something that maybe you haven't heard yet. Certainly, I think we're getting a preview of some of the different perspectives in the room and some of the challenges Odo will have trying to grapple with different and differing perspectives. Aaron, please. Aaron with an E.
Thanks, Ben. And yeah, I've appreciated the discussion from folks. I think I'll just flag that, we see this modeling approach as a critical part of understanding what it takes to implement these policies, what it takes to actually make stuff happen. The hydrogen industry right now is really working to get on its feet. It is really working to get projects built. And a large part of what we're trying to get folks aligned around is our outlook for the future, is a common understanding of the role that the hydrogen industry is expected to play. And so at least getting an understanding of what that looks like, the scope and scale of investments that we would be talking about to enable these kinds of changes, I think that is really critical for us to have those informed discussions and to be able to lean into the constructive conflict that you've identified before. I know we all have a lot of opinions and perspectives that we're bringing to this discussion, but making sure that we have an underlying data set that informs those discussions, we see as very important for, again, the collaboration and collective solutioning. So thanks, folks.
Yeah, thanks for that comment. Any other perspectives that folks want to bring into the space for today? Yeah, Brian.
Yeah, and I'm hesitant to even comment on it, but I think one of the things that I struggle with is some of the baseline assumptions that are the background material leading into this advisory group. In particular, some of the goals of electrification for everything, or the electrification of energy and the consumption of Oregon. I think identifying the goals without identifying the technology or assuming the technology is going to get there would be beneficial. To Elaine's point, hydrogen is a emerging technology that could assist with resolving some of the goals and the objectives of the state in the climate situation, that might be outside of some of those limiting factors. Speaking for like the propane industry, the Illinois institution has proven the ability to convert COT into LPG or into propane. And, there's other technologies out there that we're not necessarily aware of. And how are we not limiting ourselves to one particular technology or the electrification of everything to be able to meet some of those objectives? To a point made earlier of maybe it's a bridge to get to 2050 on the electrification, or other adoption of technologies that allow us to meet those same goals without limiting what those technologies are. And I just don't know how to kind of address that, or if that's outside the scope of this advisory committee.
Yeah, I don't know if Odo has any reflection on it. I mean, I think that's where we'll be asking you to keep bringing in. But I don't know, Odo, if you're hearing anything in Brian's comments that you want to reflect back on. But I mean, this is the work. I mean, we're getting a preview of not just the, kind of starting place and different perspectives of starting place, but, the deliberations that this group will have. And ultimately, what Odo is going to be, have to be responsive to and consider as we kind of collectively develop this state energy strategy. But I'll just pause if there's any, Joshua, I see your hand, so I want to bring you in, and then Odo, if there's any other comments, I'll ask for you all to reflect, and then I do want to create a little bit of space for the last conversation. But Joshua, jump in.
Yeah, thanks. I've really appreciated this discussion, and I don't have a lot to add, but I just want to voice support for the idea of including maybe some stretch goals, stretch climate goals in the modeling. I think, it seems to me that we have the benefit of having a broad mandate from the legislature, and there's no sort of like specific goals other than what's legislatively mandated in HB 2021 and other laws. But it seems to me that we have the benefit of maybe being able to have some stretch goals that aren't mandated, that we can kind of explore through the modeling. I also think it's important to think about this idea of more ambitious climate goals in the context of the really the trajectory of load growth that we're seeing in the state, and thinking about like what are some different scenarios for it's already going to be challenging to meet some of our existing goals with the load growth that's being projected. And so I think that's another factor that's important to think about.
Yeah, thank you, Joshua. Brian, is that an old hand or a new hand?
Sorry, old hand.
Old hand, okay. All right, well, again, as Odo has said, if there's other additional comments, you can email or add to the portal, but I do want to move us to, we wanted one more conversation to squeeze in today in our last, 15 minutes or so before we close, just around really input from you all around transparency, communication, some of the themes that emerged earlier in our discussion. Jessica, do you want to kind of introduce us into that topic, and then we'll create some space for some feedback?
Absolutely. We did hear a lot in the charter discussion about concerns around how Odo would reflect the different pieces of information that we're receiving, the different input and potentially the positions that people are taking as we go through this whole process. And I know that there's a lot of focus on sort of the policy recommendations that might come from the energy strategy, but we're still way back here in the model development. And so it feels like really a good time for us to start to get your input on how we can be transparent and provide useful information and get to that, find a way to provide all the information, get all the different perspectives in a way that's digestible for people, that makes everyone who participated feel like their views were reflected, but also keeping in mind that we have limited staffing resources, limited budget to put this together. So we do need to be able to figure out ways to wrap it up into packages for people. But to that end, I have a few questions to kind of tease out from all of you what you think some best practices might be in how we provide information about the assumptions and the data sets to use for the modeling inputs, particularly for the reference scenario, and what the what ifs that people were interested in seeing through some of the scenario analyses, the alternative scenario analyses. So next slide, if you will, Gilly. So the first question I want to throw out to the group, actually, why don't I just read the 3 questions off, and then if somebody could copy and paste them into the chat, then we can come off the slide and just talk to each other, which I think is helpful. So the first question has to do with best practices that you would recommend to us to ensure that there's transparency in the energy strategy process, particularly with this modeling inputs development. And then the second question is, are there public engagement processes that you've participated in or seen that you thought really did a good job of presenting comments, questions, and responses from different participating groups throughout the process that you thought captured that information really well? And then the last question is that in this early stage of the project, how can Odo present information for you as well as the public on where there's not broad agreement on modeling decisions, which I think is of great interest to a lot of you based on the comments we got in the charter. So those are the 3 forming questions. If other things come to you as far as transparency goes, please feel free to jump in. But I want to open up that conversation. And I do see that Jeff has asked if it'd be possible to list all the members of the advisory group in each of the work groups on the Odo website. The advisory groups are on there, and I actually haven't checked to see, but I think the working group lists are up there too as well. Maybe Josh can.
The human brain is very capable, Jeff, of interpreting even bad spelling. Alan, did you want to add?
They were also on the slides that we just presented, so all the list of the working group members were on there.
Yeah, thanks,
That'll be
John. I
posted
think,
too.
Jeff, to your point, you're getting the question. I think it's important. We'll make sure and double check that as a point of transparency, that who's been identified to serve in these working groups, advisory bodies, et cetera, that there's some transparency around who's around the table. Did you want to add, Jeff? Jump in.
Yeah, well, it's on the list that was on the draft strategy. I haven't seen it anyplace else. Now, maybe it's appeared in the last day, but I couldn't find anything on the working groups. I've heard people come up with their own lists that they think is correct. But it wasn't necessarily anything officially from Odo. And I would just think for transparency purposes, it would be great to have it available. I think it would seem to me that that would be public information, and we do want to support transparency, and it would just be one little step in that direction.
Yep, thank you, Jeff. So let's, Odo, let's collectively commit to making sure that kind of folks that have been formally identified to serve in those roles are identified on the web page. So, you know, with this broader set of questions that Jessica just posed, and again, I don't want us to kind of relitigate the conversation we had earlier around kind of how your participation and deliberation is captured. But I think as an agency, right, if you've seen best practices, so one example is, you know, ensuring that you're posting who's advising the agency, to Jeff's point. Are there processes you've been a part of from other agencies that you felt were really good best practices and for mechanisms to ensure that there's some transparency around comments, questions, responses? And then, you know, how do you best present this information, not just for you all, we've captured, right, meeting summaries and things like that. And there's a final report that you all kind of already talked about, but you know, where does this go in the short term? So I'll just open it up for you all. You might have shared a lot of these thoughts earlier, but just give an opportunity if folks have ideas, examples that we can reference, or any other comments. Yeah, Jen.
Such a simple thing, but I think more than anything, just explaining your why, right? You may not be able to get into every little detail, but at a high level, if you just explain what direction you're going in and why you're doing that, that feels like that can be helpful and gives people a little bit more opportunity to interface and engage with you based on not all the weeds, but maybe a more strategic perspective on where you're really thinking.
That's really helpful. Thanks, John. Scott?
So we get pretty heavily involved in a lot of the federal processes that specifically the Bonneville Power Administration runs, but others are, I would say, other federal agencies have in the region. And, you know, traditionally over the years, we've seen different approaches at that. I think some of the latest ones have been probably more troubling in that they've been a little bit more of a tell than an ask or a listen. And I think that, you know, it might be good for us to think about how we design in some elements where we get a chance for folks around the state to provide feedback into this group, so that we're not totally, you know, running inside of a bubble, if you will. And, you know, that feedback's, you know, could be helpful if it's channeled correctly and if it's managed correctly, you know, in terms of time limits and those kinds of things. Or if you've heard a certain theme, you know, already, because obviously sometimes we have folks that might overrun a forum to try to get a certain perspective really push through in sort of a volumetric standpoint. So I think there's some ways that again, that some of the feds have run these processes in the past that have been pretty helpful. The Northwest Power and Conservation Council is another place that I think tries to balance a variety of different constituent inputs and tries to, you know, really make sure they're channeling stakeholder perspectives. So there might be something to look at there as well. Thanks.
Yeah, good. Appreciate that input, Scott. And both lifting up what's working and avoiding what is not best practice is equally helpful.
Just to that point, Ben,
yeah,
we have had several meetings with the Power Council, and there are regular advisors on this, especially in using some of their data.
Yep, great. Thanks, Alan. Other thoughts on this piece? This might be an ongoing conversation. I mean, certainly there's an early part of the process. I think you all have named some sentiment, at least kind of philosophically, around transparency and communication, and really, you know, naming the why. Laura, jump in.
Yeah, I think one thing I've noticed just in talking to other advocates in the space, there's been a sense of pressure in terms of the state energy strategy is happening, and we have 3 weeks of meetings to provide input. And so I think increasing the transparency of what the future opportunities for input will be and what types of input are most important and when. And I think that might sort of like take a bit of the pressure off And I know that you all are kind of still working through the exact timeline and what that will look like, but I would say don't let a specific timeline uncertainty keep you from flagging, what the future opportunities might be in more general, Q3 or whatever it is. Even though some of that's still up in the air, I think that'd be helpful.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And recognizing, right, there's this kind of rapid timeline associated with the modeling, all right, and there'll be a lot of other process and timeline around kind of the policies and strategies itself that go into the plan. But I hear you loud and clear in terms of how do you kind of identify and very clearly for folks where are those touch points where feedback, input, and influence is going to be most effective. Thanks, Laura. Any other last thoughts on this piece before I kind of move us towards closing?
Ben, I just want to jump in and let
Yeah.
folks know I really hear the challenges of meeting the timeline that we put together. We will be working to get information out much further in advance, give you planning opportunities so that when we get to the policy discussions that are going to happen in Q1 of next year, I can at least say that that's going to happen. We can get you some of that information up front. So I just wanted to express my gratitude, sincere gratitude that people were able to accommodate this really fast timeline and join in. It meant a lot to us and we do appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for naming that, Jessica, and I'll share the appreciation for folks kind of jumping in on this ride and kind of the rapid start. And I just want to reiterate and appreciate your commitment to equipping this group. I think it came up at our first meeting, right? If the expectation is we're supposed to talk to constituents and communicate with our organizations, we haven't had to have enough time before meetings to be able to have those conversations. So just appreciate you naming it. Yeah, Jennifer.
Hi, and I apologize if I missed this earlier, but as public comments come in, are those posted for the public to view, or is there a way they'll be shared publicly?
Oh, great question. Who wants, Jessica?
Yeah, I'll take it. We aren't just doing an immediate post after they come in. We're trying to combine them and put them into places where we see a lot of the same comment or question. We want to be able to roll that up. And that's because we really felt strongly, we've been to some like FAQ points of other types of engagements like this, and it just gets lost in the shuffle because the same question is asked in 4 different ways and you can't find the answer to your question. So we're trying to be really thoughtful about making sure we address everyone's questions, but that we do it in a way that's accessible to other people as well. So, I think one thing that we recognize is that this is the first time we're doing a process like this, and we will make our best efforts in all cases to get the information out in ways that work. But if you feel that something wasn't shared in a timely manner, that you didn't get enough notice, or that our website is confusing, please flag that for us. We need that feedback and information because we don't always recognize it being on the other side of things. So this will be an iterative process, I'm quite sure, in how we develop the communications around this, and we want to get feedback from you throughout.
Thanks, Jessica. So I think very clearly I'm seeing both in comment and chat, pulling out the working group and advisory group, and this goes and sustains across the board. And I'll interpret this as like channeling, kind of your interested public, let alone this, right, your advisory group members, but channeling the interested public, making it as easy as possible to find the information, not have to sift through things, et cetera. So I appreciate folks just naming that and some of the other kind of best practices that folks have described. Any last comments? Otherwise, I'm going to move us to closing. Thank you for all the folks have already gotten. Not seeing any new hands. Last call. Okay. All right, Jessica, why don't we close this out? So we'll move into describing some of our next steps and what's coming up for you all.
Thanks. So we did it. It's 11:55. I think we're going to get out of here on time. Congratulations to everybody. I appreciate it. So the upcoming meeting on September 9th, the focus of that meeting will be the final proposal for modeling. This will be the reference scenario only. I am nearly positive that we won't have all of the additional scenarios to share with you. We might, but we'll let you know. We are committed to getting you that reference scenario model draft by September 4th. So not quite a week, but I think that's a reasonable deadline for us. So you'll have a little bit of time to review it before coming to the meeting. What we intend to try and flag for discussion in that meeting is areas where we see broad disagreement, and getting all of you to provide us with input on where that disagreement lay in the decisions that need to get made about what we can and can't model in the reference scenario. So that's going to be the focus of that meeting. And we'll be collecting your feedback during that. And that will be the feedback that goes into the final reference scenario that we develop. And then for October, I just want to let you know that we are working right now to get a doodle poll out to you to get that October meeting set up, and that we will try to get all the meetings set up throughout the coming year so that you can get them on your calendars and they aren't going to be something that you're having to deal with this all the time. So we will talk about a process to get those on your calendars as soon as possible. And let's see. Jennifer Hill asked to confirm the plan is to summarize public comments, not post them individually. No, the plan is right now to summarize the comments that we've gotten and not post them individually, but we're going to still talk through what we think are helpful processes throughout this, throughout the process of the energy strategy. So Jennifer, in particular, I understand that there are a lot of practices where they just attribute the comments directly. If people find that to be helpful, we can look at a way where people could easily search the comments. And to that end, letting you know that we are hiring there's a new position. They will be coming on board on September 30th. Once they get on board, they have worked with all sorts of public comment periods with the federal government. And so they're going to be able to hit the ground running and help us with organizing how we're going to present these. So I just don't have specifics right now on how that will work. We need their input once they get here, but we will make it so that it's something that is accessible and that you can get the information that you need. But I'm just not sure if we're always going to do individual comments and attributions throughout the entire process. There might be places where roll up is better.
Yeah, that's helpful, Jessica. So let's go to the next slide, and then I'll just acknowledge, and I imagine this is likely true for some of the Odo team as well, that the long legislative session may create all kinds of challenges for getting us in a room together, depending on what's happening and when. So I'll just acknowledge that. We do have opportunities for public comment. So as I named at the beginning, we're not building that into a formal part of our agenda and just building off the conversation we just had. The process is receiving public comments. So for those in the audience or constituents that may be interested in written public comment over the next several weeks on this process, there's a link on this slide. We're at 11:59. Ruchi, I'd love to pass it to you if you want to go to the last slide, and any other closing comments before we send people on their way.
Yeah, thank you so much. I did want to say that, that conversation that we had around the more aggressive scenario, that is I just wanted to recognize we're going to have further discussion on which 5 alternative scenarios we're going to choose. This could be one, but we weren't asking you to sort of form a final opinion right now without more input and discussion on what those other alternatives might be. It was kind of almost like, let's start getting juicy right now. We know that this is an area that's going to be needing your feedback. So getting your thoughts early was part of the intent, and sort of practicing some of this charter and process piece, the criteria that Jessica laid out was part of our intent in bringing a kind of thorny question to you at the forefront. But that's why you're here, and that's why we're so appreciative that you're here. And I'll close with just that gratitude and appreciation.
Thank you, Richie. Well, it is exactly 12 o'clock. Appreciate all y'all. We'll be in touch, and yeah, much love. Have a wonderful day. Thank you all.